Hey guys, tonight we're going to journey into the heart of one of the greatest civilizations to ever grace the earth, ancient Egypt. Picture the endless stretch of the Nile River, its waters glistening under the scorching sun, shimmering as it stretches toward the horizon. The land around it, fertile and teeming with life, unlike the parched deserts that surround it. The people of Egypt, with their sophisticated knowledge of farming, didn't just survive in this harsh environment, they thrived. The ancient Egyptians were the masters of agriculture, and tonight we're going to uncover their secret to sustainable farming. Now you might be thinking, yeah, sure, they had the Nile, but surely it wasn't all sunshine and easy crops. And you'd be right to wonder. Because let's face it, if you were plopped down in ancient Egypt, there's a good chance you wouldn't survive. But that's the magic of their agricultural ingenuity. They not only made it work, they made it thrive in a place that should have been impossible to farm. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Also, drop your location and local time in the comments. It's always fun to see where everyone's tuning in from. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The Nile River was more than just the centerpiece of Egyptian life. It was its lifeblood. To fully understand how the ancient Egyptians pulled off their remarkable agricultural feats, you need to start here, with the river. The Nile was, and still is, the longest river in the world, snaking its way across northeastern Africa, connecting a swath of land that spans over 4,000 miles. But it wasn't just a body of water. It was the most reliable, most essential source of life for the people of Egypt. Without it, the land would have been nothing but barren desert, and Egypt's existence as a civilization would have never been possible. You can almost hear the rhythmic flow of the Nile's waters as it winds across the land, carving deep valleys in the otherwise arid terrain. But the river's significance wasn't just its constant presence. It was its annual flooding, the inundation, that brought fertile silt and nutrients from deep within Africa all the way to Egypt's fields. Every year, from June to September, the river would overflow, flooding the surrounding land and turning the desert into a fertile oasis. It was this flood that the Egyptians relied on to grow the food that would feed their civilization. And you're probably thinking, wait, they didn't have machines to control the floods, right? Absolutely right. The flooding was something they couldn't control, but the Egyptians found ways to work with it. The floodwaters would deposit nutrient-rich silt, making the soil highly fertile and ideal for planting. But once the floodwaters receded, the work of farming really began. While the annual flooding created ideal conditions for crops, the Egyptians knew they couldn't just leave everything to chance. They needed to maximize the fertile land the Nile provided, and that's where their ingenuity came in. Historians still argue whether the Egyptians understood the exact science behind the flooding, but they certainly knew how to predict it. They tracked the rising waters of the Nile, anticipating when it would inundate the fields. This foresight allowed them to plant their crops at just the right time, ensuring they would be able to make the most of the fertile soil. But there was a little more to it than just planting when the river flooded. The Egyptians had mastered a variety of techniques to manage and make the most of their land, and this mastery of irrigation and flood control would be the backbone of their farming success. Now that you've got the picture of the Nile's importance, let's talk about what happened when the floodwaters began to recede. The Egyptians weren't just sitting around waiting for nature to do its thing. Oh no, they were getting their hands dirty, actively shaping the land to make sure the flood's blessings didn't turn into a problem. After all, if the floodwaters didn't drain properly, or if they left too much standing water, crops could drown, rot, or be attacked by pests. But if managed well, the flood created an agricultural paradise. Imagine this. The sun beats down on you, the air thick with heat, and all around you, the Nile has just receded, leaving behind mud-covered land. The Egyptians had developed a finely tuned understanding of this process. As soon as the waters receded, they would begin the work of reclaiming the land, ensuring it would be ready for planting. This was where irrigation came into play, and their methods were far more advanced than you might think. One of their most significant contributions was the use of a system of canals, dikes, and basins. They dug these channels to guide the water from the Nile to where it was needed most. Essentially, they created a network of many rivers that would irrigate the land beyond the immediate reach of the Nile's flood. The canals and basins ensured that water would remain in the fields long enough to soak deeply into the soil, allowing crops to flourish even after the floodwaters had long gone. And let's not forget the shaduf, one of the earliest irrigation tools ever created. This simple yet ingenious device consisted of a long pole with a bucket attached at one end and a counterweight at the other. It was used to lift water from the river or from smaller canals and carry it to higher ground. Imagine the Egyptians using this tool, the sound of the water splashing into the basins and the rhythmic pulling of the shaduf day after day, year after year. It's almost poetic in its simplicity, isn't it? It may not seem like much by modern standards, but it was revolutionary in its time. And it didn't just help with irrigation, it also helped with moving water to places that were difficult to reach. In fact, some believe that the Egyptians even used the shaduf in the building of the Great Pyramids, moving materials like stones and sand around their colossal constructions. Talk about multitasking. Historians still argue whether the Egyptians invented the shaduf independently or whether they borrowed the concept from other civilizations in the region. Some suggest that the device might have come from Mesopotamia, but Egypt is widely credited with refining the technique and putting it to widespread use. What is clear, however, is how effective this simple tool was, allowing Egyptians to create reliable irrigation systems that helped them farm on land that otherwise would have been completely barren. But of course, irrigation wasn't just about moving water around. It was about using water efficiently, and that's where the Egyptians' genius showed through. They didn't just flood everything. They understood the nuances of water management. For example, during the dry season, they would fill up large basins during the flood season, which would then hold water and allow for farming during the months when the Nile was low. This strategic use of water allowed the Egyptians to plant crops like wheat, barley, and flax, even in times when the Nile wasn't actively flooding the land. It's almost as if they had discovered the art of watering on demand long before we had drip irrigation systems. But here's where things get a little interesting. The ancient Egyptians didn't just rely on the Nile for water. They also used other water sources, including underground wells, and they were skilled at digging and maintaining these wells. In fact, they built a network of wells and water reservoirs that would provide water during the dry season, ensuring that their crops stayed hydrated even when nature wasn't cooperating. Talk about planning ahead. When you think about it, it's pretty mind-blowing that the Egyptians were able to maintain such a sophisticated farming system using only the resources available to them at the time. It wasn't just the tools they had, it was their deep, almost spiritual connection to the land, their understanding of when to plant, when to harvest, and crucially, how to keep the land fertile year after year. Their relationship with the Nile was one of harmony and balance, where they had to work with nature, not against it. But it wasn't all about the tools and techniques. The Egyptians were also deeply spiritual people, and they believed that the fertility of the land was a gift from the gods. The inundation of the Nile wasn't just a natural phenomenon, it was a divine blessing. And so, alongside their practical knowledge of farming, the Egyptians also had a series of agricultural rituals and prayers that they would perform to honor the gods and ensure the success of their crops. These rituals were an essential part of the farming calendar, and they believed that without the blessings of the gods, their crops might fail, and their civilization could fall into ruin. Historians still debate how much of Egyptian farming was guided by superstition versus sheer practicality. But the truth is, their belief in divine intervention was likely just as important as their understanding of irrigation and crop management. After all, a little extra help from the gods couldn't hurt, right? Seeded, the shadufs have done their work, and the fields are now ready for planting. But there's one crucial element that made ancient Egypt's farming so successful: the soil. You see, the Nile's annual flooding didn't just provide water, it also brought with it rich, fertile silt. This silt was the secret sauce that transformed the barren land into one of the most productive agricultural regions in the ancient world. The river's inundation deposited this nutrient-rich mud, which was packed with minerals and organic matter, perfect for growing crops. Without it, the fields of Egypt would have been little more than dry, cracked earth. Picture it now. A farmer walks across a freshly flooded field, the squelch of the mud beneath their sandals, feeling the warmth of the sun on their back. The floodwaters have brought with them a layer of soft, dark soil that will nourish their crops for months to come. It's almost as if the land itself is being reborn every year, thanks to the yearly gift from the Nile. This was the natural cycle that the Egyptians depended on, year after year, century after century. But how much did the Egyptians really understand about this process? Historians still argue whether the Egyptians knew the scientific reason behind the fertility of the land, or if it was something they simply accepted as divine providence. It's likely that they didn't understand the finer details of soil science as we do today, but they certainly knew what worked. The floodwaters provided the essential nutrients that the crops needed to thrive, and that knowledge was passed down through generations, allowing the Egyptians to maintain such a high level of agricultural productivity. The result of this constant replenishment of soil was that the Egyptians could grow an impressive array of crops. Wheat, barley, flax, and legumes were staples, forming the basis of the Egyptian diet. But they didn't stop there. The fertile soil allowed for the cultivation of a wide variety of fruits and vegetables, from onions and garlic to melons and figs. The Egyptians were even growing grapes for wine, a product that would become an important part of their religious rituals and trade. But it wasn't just about food. The rich, fertile soil of Egypt allowed the people to grow materials for clothing, like flax, which was spun into linen. Linen was highly prized in Egypt, and it wasn't just used for garments, it was also used for the wrappings of mummies, of course. In fact, some of the finest linen garments were worn by the pharaohs and the elite, a symbol of their status. The production of linen was so important that it became one of Egypt's major exports. But the real beauty of this fertile land was its sustainability. Thanks to the annual flooding, the soil was constantly replenished with nutrients. This allowed the Egyptians to farm the same land for generations without worrying about soil depletion. Contrast that with other ancient civilizations that didn't have access to the same natural fertilization. Without the constant replenishment of the Nile, their land would have eventually become unproductive. The Egyptians, however, had a cycle that ensured their soil remained rich and their crops flourished. Of course, the Egyptians didn't just rely on the floodwaters alone to sustain their farming system. They were savvy when it came to soil management, and they knew how to make the most of what the land had to offer. They would use the fertile silt to build up raised fields and create dikes to prevent the waters from flooding the same areas year after year. This helped keep the soil healthy and productive without exhausting its resources. They also understood the importance of crop rotation. By rotating crops in different fields, they ensured that the soil didn't become overworked or lose its fertility. This kind of long-term planning was key to the sustainability of their agricultural system, and it's something that we're still learning about today. Crop rotation is a cornerstone of modern farming, but it's clear that the ancient Egyptians were already practicing it thousands of years ago. Historians still debate the extent of Egypt's crop rotation practices, with some suggesting that it was more ad hoc, based on necessity, rather than a deliberate system. But the fact remains that the Egyptians had an incredible understanding of how to manage their land. They weren't just throwing seeds into the ground and hoping for the best. They were cultivating an environment that would continue to support them for centuries. And let's not forget the animals. The role of livestock in Egyptian farming was just as crucial as the land itself. Animals such as cows, goats, and sheep provided manure, which was used as fertilizer to enrich the soil. This made for a perfect cycle. The land would provide food for the animals, and the animals in turn would provide manure to fertilize the land. It was a system that worked in harmony, ensuring that the land remained productive year after year. But the animals did more than just contribute to farming. They were a status symbol, too. The wealthy elite of Egypt kept large herds of cattle, and owning livestock was a sign of prosperity. The Egyptian gods, too, had strong associations with animals. Cows, for example, were sacred to Hathor, the goddess of love, fertility, and motherhood, and were often depicted in religious artwork and temple reliefs. So, while livestock played a vital role in maintaining Egypt's farming system, they also had deep spiritual and cultural significance. In the end, the fertility of Egypt's land was a product of many factors, but perhaps the most important was the land's relationship with the Nile. It wasn't just the river itself, it was the entire ecosystem that had developed around it. From the nutrient-rich silt deposited by the annual flooding to the careful irrigation systems, crop rotation, and use of manure, the Egyptians had created a sustainable farming system that allowed them to thrive in one of the harshest environments on Earth. And as you can probably guess, the combination of fertile soil, advanced farming techniques, and the use of animals meant that Egypt's food supply was more than secure. It was abundant. So, next time you picture ancient Egypt, think not just of the pyramids and mummies, but of the life-sustaining power of the land and the people who knew exactly how to make it work. Fertile, the crops are in the ground, and the annual cycle of flooding, planting, and harvesting is in full swing. You might be wondering, how did the Egyptians sustain this system long term? It's not just about water, soil, or even the crops. They needed to ensure the system was in place to keep the crops growing year after year, generation after generation. And that's where something incredible happens. Ancient Egypt's farming ingenuity goes beyond just the basics of irrigation and crop rotation. They mastered the art of soil enrichment in a way that would make modern-day farmers take notes. The key to this was the nutrient-rich silt brought by the annual flooding of the Nile. Sure, the floods deposited fertile soil, but the Egyptians went one step further by ensuring that the silt's effectiveness wasn't wasted. This wasn't just a natural gift. They worked with it. The Egyptians had a method of recycling the soil and maximizing its use by adding organic matter, especially animal manure, to it. But it wasn't just any manure. They carefully used the manure from their livestock, particularly cows, goats, and sheep, as natural fertilizer to further enhance the soil's fertility. This created a cycle of fertility that kept the land producing without the need for artificial chemicals or external sources. The same animals that helped plow the fields were also contributing to the success of the crops they helped plant. It's a beautiful, self-sustaining circle. Imagine walking across one of these farm fields. You would smell the earthy scent of fresh manure mixed with the musky aroma of wet soil as the rich silt left behind by the floods is worked into the earth. Farmers would gather dung from their herds and spread it across the fields, making sure the soil stayed nutrient-dense. This allowed them to keep the land productive over the long term. And while modern methods might be faster and more high-tech, this cycle of using natural resources was a sustainable farming practice that worked wonders for Egypt's agriculture for millennia. But that's not all. The ancient Egyptians didn't just settle for whatever nutrients the soil had to offer. They were extremely resourceful, finding ways to enhance the soil further through the addition of other organic materials, like ash from burned plants, which acted as a kind of natural compost. They would also rotate crops not only to prevent overuse of the soil, but to mix in nitrogen-fixing plants like legumes, which restored essential nutrients to the ground. With every crop rotation, the Egyptians ensured that their soil stayed rich, diverse, and continuously productive. This deep understanding of soil management was far ahead of its time, and it's still something we grapple with today in modern farming. Soil depletion is a major problem in many parts of the world today, with farming practices leading to the erosion of essential nutrients. Yet the Egyptians knew that maintaining the balance between plant, animal, and soil was crucial to ensuring long-term productivity. Historians still argue about how much of this knowledge was passed down from older civilizations, such as those in Mesopotamia, or if it was something that the Egyptians developed completely on their own. But the fact remains that ancient Egypt's agricultural techniques were not just efficient, They were sustainable in a way that many modern systems still strive for. While today's farmers may have access to synthetic fertilizers and technology, the Egyptians relied on a holistic system that worked in harmony with nature. They didn't just farm, they stewarded the land in a way that allowed it to give back year after year. And let's not forget the role of Egypt's sacred beliefs in farming. The Egyptians' deep connection to their gods played an important part in the fertility rituals that they believed were necessary to ensure their crops thrived. Agriculture was often intertwined with religion, and the fertility of the land was seen as a blessing from the gods. This wasn't just superstition. Rituals were a central part of the Egyptian agricultural calendar. For instance, the Egyptian god Hapi, who was believed to govern the annual flooding of the Nile, was often invoked in these agricultural ceremonies. People would offer prayers and sacrifices to Hapi, asking for a bountiful flood. This connection between farming and the divine gave Egyptians a sense of purpose and reassurance. In their eyes, the cycle of flooding, planting, and harvesting was an ongoing sacred act, one that sustained not just their civilization, but their spiritual connection to the gods. Historians still argue about the role religion played in Egyptian farming. Some believe that the ritualistic aspect of farming was mostly about giving the people a sense of comfort, while others argue that it was an essential part of how the Egyptians managed their crops. What we do know, however, is that the Egyptians believed their agricultural practices were guided by divine forces, and these practices helped ensure the success of their crops. The rituals themselves were as much about maintaining the balance of the land as they were about appeasing the gods. But beyond the rituals, there was something else that tied Egyptian farming together: the importance of the pharaoh. As the ruler of Egypt, the pharaoh was considered not just a political leader, but also a divine representative of the gods. This divine status meant that the pharaoh's role extended beyond governance and into the agricultural realm. The pharaoh was thought to control the flow of the Nile, and his actions were believed to directly affect the success of the crops. Every successful harvest, every full granary, was a reflection of the pharaoh's divine favor. The pharaohs didn't just oversee agricultural practices, they were actively involved in supporting the systems that ensured Egypt's farming prosperity. From building irrigation systems to overseeing the construction of large granaries, the pharaohs played a direct role in maintaining Egypt's agricultural efficiency. In fact, the construction of the pyramids, although primarily a monumental achievement, also had agricultural implications. The vast labor force needed for these projects often involved farmers during the off-season, and the logistics of feeding such a workforce required extensive planning and management of resources, showcasing the pharaoh's influence on every aspect of Egypt's farming system. So, whether through careful soil management, sacred rituals, or the guidance of the pharaoh, the ancient Egyptians had a deeply embedded system that worked together to sustain their civilization. It wasn't just about surviving. No, the Egyptians understood the land, the rhythms of nature, and how to work with them to build a thriving agricultural society. They didn't just cultivate the land, they cultivated a culture of sustainability that helped Egypt endure for thousands of years. We've covered how the land was prepared and the soil enriched. Let's take a closer look at the methods the Egyptians used to farm beyond the seasonal flooding of the Nile. As you can imagine, the floodwaters didn't last forever, and not all the land around the Nile was constantly in reach of the annual inundation. For the Egyptians to continue farming during the dry months, they had to develop a variety of clever techniques to make use of the remaining land and water sources. They weren't just waiting for the next flood, they had to make sure that there were crops to harvest year-round. So, let's take a step into the dry season, when the fields would typically lie dormant, and the Nile's waters would recede far away from some of the farthest reaches of the kingdom. The Egyptians, though, didn't just sit back and wait for the next inundation. They understood that to make their agricultural system truly sustainable, they needed to maintain a steady food supply, even in those in-between months, and that's where irrigation really came into play. First, they had to find a way to store the water that had been used during the flood season and direct it to fields that were not immediately near the river. To do this, the Egyptians built systems of basins and canals to hold and direct water, essentially creating mini reservoirs. These basins could be filled during the flooding and drained during the dry months, providing irrigation to crops that weren't directly on the river's path. This was a huge leap forward in farming technology, allowing Egypt to grow crops during a time when other civilizations would struggle with drought. If you were there, you might picture workers carefully managing the release of water from these basins, using wooden gates and simple, yet effective tools to control the flow. The sound of water gurgling through the canals, the rustling of the papyrus reeds on the banks, and the low hum of activity from the farmers would fill the air. The fields, once barren and dry, would soon be bathed in a gentle stream of life-giving water. The Egyptians had truly mastered the art of controlling nature. Historians still argue whether the Egyptians developed this kind of water management independently, or whether they borrowed some ideas from neighboring civilizations. Some believe that the Mesopotamians, with their advanced irrigation systems, could have influenced Egyptian methods. Others, however, point out that Egypt's unique geography, its narrow strip of arable land along the Nile, necessitated the development of these highly specialized systems. No matter how it happened, what's clear is that the Egyptians didn't just rely on luck. They were ahead of the curve in terms of engineering and resource management. But it wasn't just about canals and basins. The Egyptians also developed an intricate system of wells to tap into groundwater reserves. Wells were dug in places where the water table was closer to the surface, allowing for easy access to water even when the Nile wasn't overflowing its banks. This was another critical step in ensuring that the Egyptians could maintain agriculture even in times of drought. Think of the workers carefully digging and shaping the well, the smell of damp earth rising as they reached the water below. It must have been an exhausting yet essential part of the process, ensuring that even the farthest regions of Egypt could still receive the water they needed. In addition to these ingenious water management systems, the Egyptians also took advantage of the natural landscape. They would often build terraces along hillsides, directing water into these elevated plots. This technique allowed them to cultivate crops on land that otherwise would have been too steep to farm. The terraces, carefully arranged, acted like steps, each one a small plot of fertile soil. As the water trickled down, it nourished each level, making the most of the land's natural contour. This practice was not only an effective use of space, but also demonstrated the Egyptians' deep understanding of how to manipulate their environment to maximize agricultural productivity. But perhaps one of the most surprising methods the Egyptians used for farming during the dry season was the use of dung. Again, not just as fertilizer, but in some cases it was used to create a natural mulch for crops. Animal dung was spread across the fields after planting to keep moisture in the soil, reducing evaporation in the hot, dry months. The smell of this might not have been exactly pleasant, but it was highly effective, helping the crops survive and thrive despite the lack of regular flooding. If you were standing in one of these fields, you'd see farmers covered in the hot desert sun, hunched over their crops, working diligently to spread the manure around the young plants. The air would be thick with the smell of earth, dung, and the faint traces of the Nile. It's hard to imagine, but these seemingly simple techniques were what allowed Egypt to sustain itself for so long, even when the river wasn't actively providing. The Egyptians were also masters of timing. They understood the exact moments to plant, irrigate, and harvest in order to make the most of the natural rhythms. This deep knowledge of the land, combined with their water management strategies, meant that they could produce not only enough food to feed their population, but also a surplus to store, trade, and feed workers engaged in monumental construction projects like the Great Pyramids. The agricultural bounty of Egypt wasn't just a means of survival, it was a foundation for their entire civilization. Historians still debate whether the Egyptians understood the science behind crop growth, soil moisture, and water retention as well as we do today. While we now have sophisticated tools to measure and monitor these processes, the ancient Egyptians relied on keen observation and trial and error. It's likely they didn't have access to modern agricultural research, but their dedication to learning from the land, combined with centuries of passed down knowledge, allowed them to create one of the most sustainable and efficient farming systems in history. So, while other civilizations were struggling with the challenges of droughts and soil depletion, the Egyptians continued to thrive thanks to their innovative water management techniques. These methods weren't just about surviving, they were about thriving in an unforgiving environment where life could be harsh, but the right practices could turn the land into a source of unimaginable wealth and prosperity. Management and soil fertility. But there's another key factor in ancient Egyptian agriculture that was just as critical: the tools they used. Without the right tools, no matter how fertile the land or abundant the water, farming could become a frustrating, inefficient task. Luckily, the Egyptians weren't just relying on their hands and backs to get the job done. They developed a range of tools and methods that helped them work smarter, not harder. These tools were essential in ensuring that the agriculture of ancient Egypt was as effective as it was sustainable. One of the most famous tools the Egyptians invented for farming was the shadoof. If you've been paying attention, you've already heard of this clever device. The shadoof was a simple yet incredibly effective tool used to lift water from the Nile or smaller canals to irrigate fields. Think of a large wooden pole with a bucket attached to one end and a counterweight at the other. You'd use the pole to scoop water from a lower level and lift it to a higher one, all with the assistance of gravity and a little muscle. The sound of the pole creaking and the water splashing into the basin would echo through the fields, and with each pull, the farm would get a little bit closer to having its crops properly irrigated. Historians still argue whether the Egyptians invented the shadoof completely on their own or whether they borrowed the concept from other civilizations, but what's certain is that they perfected it. The tool was an essential part of their agricultural system, and it didn't just help with irrigation. It could also be used to transport materials like sand, clay, or even stones, which made it an indispensable piece of technology for Egyptians. Whether working the fields or building the grand monuments of Egypt, the shadoof was a tool that helped facilitate many aspects of daily life. But the Egyptians didn't just rely on the shadoof for water management. They also had an array of other tools that aided in every part of the farming process, from planting to harvesting. Plows were another key tool in their agricultural arsenal. Though they didn't have modern tractors, the Egyptians used a simple wooden plow with a metal blade to break up the soil and create furrows for planting seeds. This tool was pulled by oxen, which were essential in providing the necessary power to work the land. Picture a pair of oxen slowly moving through the field, the plow cutting through the earth, and the farmer guiding the animals with steady hands. This early form of plowing was important not just for making the soil more workable, but for ensuring that it was aerated, allowing water and nutrients to reach the plant's roots more effectively. The plow may not have been a high-tech piece of machinery by today's standards, but in the ancient world, it was an engineering marvel. Its design was simple, but its effect was profound, making farming much more efficient and productive. Now, let's talk about hoes, a tool we tend to overlook today. But back in Egypt, the hoe was critical for preparing the soil, especially for the smaller scale farming that took place after the initial plowing. The Egyptians would use a heavy, flat blade to break up compacted soil, weed out unwanted plants, and level the surface for sowing seeds. The hoe would have been used by nearly every farmer, from the wealthy landowners to the laborers who worked the fields. Its versatility made it indispensable, and much like the plow, it played a huge role in shaping Egypt's agricultural success. But farming wasn't just about moving water or breaking up soil, it was also about planting. And for that, the Egyptians developed tools like seeders, simple devices that helped evenly distribute seeds across the fields. The basic seeder consisted of a basket with a hole in the bottom, which was carried across the field and shaken to drop seeds into the soil below. Though it may sound primitive, this tool helped ensure that the crops were planted in an organized manner, which not only improved efficiency, but also increased yields. A well-organized field with evenly spaced seeds would grow more uniformly and be much easier to harvest. And when it came to harvesting, the Egyptians relied on the simple but effective sickle, a curved blade with a handle. The sickle was used to cut down crops once they had ripened. The sharpness of the blade meant that a skilled worker could harvest large amounts of grain in a short period of time. The rhythmic sound of the sickle cutting through the stalks of wheat or barley would have been a common soundtrack across the Nile Valley during harvest season. It's easy to imagine the fields teeming with workers, their sickles flashing in the sunlight as they gathered the crops. The sickle wasn't just a tool for efficiency, it was a symbol of the labor that powered Egypt's agricultural economy. But what's perhaps most remarkable about these tools is that they weren't just functional, they were also durable. The Egyptians knew how to make tools that would last. The materials they used, wood, stone, metal, were carefully selected for their strength and ability to withstand the tough conditions of farming. The design of the tools was simple but highly effective. And because they were made with such care, they could be used for generations. Historians still argue about the exact origins of these tools and how their designs evolved, but one thing is clear. The Egyptians were highly skilled in toolmaking, and these tools were an essential part of their farming success. Without them, they wouldn't have been able to harness the full potential of the land or the water that surrounded them. These tools were as much a part of Egyptian life as the fields they worked in, the crops they grew, and the gods they worshipped. As we step back and look at the big picture, it becomes clear that Egypt's agricultural prowess wasn't just about the land, the river, or even the technology. It was about the people. The Egyptians worked tirelessly, using their intelligence, ingenuity, and creativity to transform a harsh, arid landscape into one of the most productive agricultural systems the world has ever seen. Whether through the use of tools, water management, or soil enrichment, the Egyptians proved that with the right approach, even the most challenging environments can be made to flourish. Tools and irrigation systems helped sustain Egypt's farming practices. There was another unsung hero in the agricultural system: livestock. As much as the fertile soil and the Nile's waters were central to Egyptian success, it's the animals that provided essential support, both for practical purposes and for boosting the productivity of the land. Livestock wasn't just about food or companionship. They were crucial to sustaining the agricultural system, and their role was just as important as the work done by human hands. Let's start with the obvious: oxen. These mighty animals were the powerhouses of Egyptian farming, not only pulling plows, but also aiding in the transportation of materials like grains, stone, and wood. Their strength allowed the Egyptians to plow large areas of land quickly and efficiently, ensuring that there was enough room for crops to grow. With the use of oxen, the Egyptians were able to till soil that would have been too difficult for human labor alone. The sight of oxen pulling plows across the fields would have been common in the ancient Egyptian landscape, working side by side with human laborers under the scorching sun. But oxen didn't just help with plowing, they were also crucial for irrigation. As you've already learned, the Egyptians used shadoofs to lift water for irrigation, but oxen were often employed to help in this process as well. The water lifting mechanisms required strength to operate, and the Egyptians figured out how to use oxen to drive these devices. This allowed for more water to be lifted more efficiently, supporting crops during the dry season when the Nile's flooding wasn't available to irrigate the land. But it wasn't just oxen that played a role in Egypt's agriculture. The goats and sheep also made their contributions, primarily by providing milk, wool, and meat. But their real value lay in something a little less glamorous: manure. Yes, animal dung was a cornerstone of Egypt's agricultural sustainability. Goats, in particular, were used extensively for their droppings, which were spread across the fields to fertilize the soil. This not only provided the much-needed nutrients for crops, but also helped to create a system where nothing went to waste. The manure served as a natural fertilizer that kept the soil rich and productive, ensuring that crops continued to thrive year after year. In fact, much of Egypt's agricultural success was based on this cyclical use of resources. The crops fed the animals, The animals provided fertilizer for the crops, and the farmers themselves tended to both the plants and the animals. This simple but highly effective system was central to the sustainability of Egyptian farming practices. Historians still argue about the exact roles each type of animal played in the agricultural system. Some believe that the Egyptians relied more heavily on cattle, while others argue that smaller animals like goats and sheep had just as significant an impact. It's likely that the Egyptians used a combination of both, with cattle being the primary draft animals for heavy labor, and goats and sheep providing more localized benefits, such as manure and dairy products. Regardless of which animals did what, it's clear that livestock were a key part of the agricultural puzzle. They were the foundation upon which much of the farming success was built. Beyond their role in farming, animals also held religious and symbolic significance in ancient Egypt. Gods and goddesses were often depicted with animals, and many of Egypt's deities had strong associations with fertility, agriculture, and livestock. For example, the goddess Hathor, who was associated with love, motherhood, and fertility, was often depicted as a cow. Her connection to cows and cattle reflected the importance of livestock in the Egyptian world. Cows were not just sources of physical labor and nourishment. They were seen as divine symbols of fertility and abundance. The sacred nature of cattle is reflected in the way that Egypt's elite, particularly the pharaohs, were able to maintain large herds of cattle, using them as symbols of power and prosperity. The Egyptians also believed that their gods controlled the agricultural cycle. The annual flooding of the Nile was considered a direct blessing from the gods, especially the god Hapi, who was revered as the deity of the Nile's inundation. Hapi was depicted as a large, prosperous man with swollen breasts and a beard, symbolizing the abundance that the Nile's floodwaters brought to Egypt. In fact, the success of Egypt's farming system was tied directly to these divine forces, and farmers often offered prayers and sacrifices to ensure a bountiful harvest. Some historians still debate how much these spiritual beliefs influenced the actual practices of farming, while others argue that the spiritual and practical aspects were so intertwined that it's impossible to separate them. What is clear is that the Egyptians believed that their agricultural success was not simply due to human effort, but was the result of divine favor. This religious framework may have provided the Egyptians with a sense of purpose and confidence, even during the challenging months when the floods didn't arrive as expected or when pestilence threatened crops. But while the role of animals was clearly significant, it wasn't just about feeding and fertilizing. The Egyptians also relied on laborers to manage and maintain these complex agricultural systems. These laborers were not always slaves, as is commonly assumed. Many were seasonal workers, farmers who worked on the land during the off-season, when the flooding subsided, or at the request of the pharaoh for large-scale construction projects. In fact, the labor force was as much about cooperation as it was about necessity. Farmers worked together, helping each other with harvests and irrigation, often under the direction of overseers who ensured that the system ran smoothly. At the same time, this organized labor force also allowed Egypt to engage in massive agricultural projects, such as the construction of massive storage facilities, granaries, and even temples. The labor required for these monumental structures was significant, and Egypt's ability to provide food and resources for these workers was a direct result of its well-managed agricultural system. The vast labor force wasn't just about building monuments, it was about ensuring that the entire agricultural economy could sustain such large-scale efforts. In the end, the Egyptians' relationship with their animals, whether through oxen, goats, or cows, was a key part of their agricultural success. These animals not only provided sustenance, they also supported the entire agricultural structure, from fertilizing the soil to pulling plows. The combination of efficient animal husbandry and their advanced irrigation systems created a farming system that was both effective and sustainable, one that could support a thriving civilization for thousands of years. The land, the water, the tools, and the animals. But there's one more essential ingredient to Egypt's agricultural success that we need to explore: the massive infrastructure that supported it all. While the fertile Nile Valley, with its rich soil and annual flooding, made it possible to grow crops, it was the extensive network of canals, dikes, and storage facilities that turned agriculture into a well-oiled machine, ensuring that food could be both grown and preserved efficiently. Imagine, if you will, walking alongside the banks of the Nile. You see fields stretching out in every direction, with workers tending crops, moving water, and guiding plows. But behind the scenes, there's a lot more going on than meets the eye. Over the centuries, the Egyptians built a series of irrigation canals that spread out from the Nile, allowing water to reach fields far beyond the immediate banks of the river. These canals weren't just small, rudimentary ditches, they were carefully engineered, with some stretching for miles, carving through the landscape to deliver water exactly where it was needed. The work that went into constructing these canals was a huge undertaking, requiring knowledge of hydraulics and a precise understanding of how water flows across land. To manage the canals, the Egyptians developed a sophisticated system of dikes to control the floodwaters and prevent them from overflowing into populated areas. Dikes were essentially embankments or barriers built along the canals or around fields to control the flow of water. These dikes not only protected against the threat of flooding, but also helped distribute water evenly to different parts of the farming landscape. Without these dikes, the floodwaters would have been too unpredictable, and crops would have been damaged or washed away. Along with the canals and dikes, the Egyptians also constructed massive storage facilities to ensure that surplus crops could be stored for the future. These granaries, often built of mud brick and stone, were spread throughout the kingdom to store grain, which was Egypt's primary agricultural output. The storage of grain was crucial, not just for ensuring food security during times of famine or drought, but also for stabilizing the economy. The granaries could hold vast quantities of grain, which would be distributed to workers, the military, and even neighboring civilizations through trade. Let's take a moment to imagine the scale of these granaries. Picture a vast, low-slung building made from sun-dried mud bricks, the smell of grains and earth filling the air. Inside, the grain would be carefully stored in large clay jars or pits, ensuring that it stayed cool and dry. The Egyptians had to be meticulous about this because the preservation of their grain was absolutely essential. If the grain was stored improperly, it could spoil, attracting pests like rats or weevils, or even worse, it could ferment or become moldy. The precision of their storage methods speaks to the level of care the Egyptians took in preserving their resources. These storage facilities were more than just buildings. They were critical to Egypt's survival, ensuring a constant food supply for both the population and the state. Historians still argue about the extent to which Egypt's agricultural system relied on these kinds of structures. Some scholars believe that the most sophisticated systems were only used during the New Kingdom period, when Egypt's power and reach were at their peak. Others argue that Egypt's agricultural infrastructure was highly developed much earlier. What is clear, though, is that these structures weren't just symbols of power, they were functional, providing the logistical support necessary to maintain Egypt's agricultural system. Now, think about the role of the pharaohs in all of this. While the land and water were vital, it was the leadership of the pharaohs that ensured the agricultural system remained efficient and effective. The pharaohs were not just political rulers, they were seen as divine beings, intermediaries between the gods and the people. This meant that their role extended far beyond governance. They were responsible for ensuring the prosperity of the land, including overseeing agricultural projects and infrastructure. They often enacted large-scale building projects, like the construction of dams, dikes, and canals, which required vast amounts of labor. The labor force for these projects was not just composed of slaves, as is commonly believed. Many were seasonal workers who were drafted to work during the off-season of farming. The construction of these infrastructures wasn't just about feeding the population. It was also about control. By overseeing such vast agricultural resources, the pharaohs were able to exert influence over the people. Controlling food meant controlling power, and the ability to provide surplus grain to their people gave the pharaohs immense leverage. Whether in times of peace or war, The grain stored in Egypt's massive granaries was a symbol of Egypt's stability, and the pharaoh's control over this wealth was part of what allowed them to maintain their divine status. Additionally, the Egyptians didn't just use granaries to store food for internal use. They were also a key part of Egypt's economy and trade networks. Egypt's surplus grain was exchanged with neighboring civilizations, such as those in Mesopotamia and the Levant, as part of extensive trade routes that stretched across the ancient world. The ability to trade grain and other agricultural products helped Egypt build wealth and maintain political and military influence. And let's not forget the role of the temples in this process. Many temples played an active role in managing land and agricultural resources on behalf of the gods, acting as both religious centers and economic hubs. This link between religion, politics, and agriculture further cemented the pharaoh's role as both ruler and divine intermediary. Historians still debate the complexities of the pharaoh's control over Egypt's agricultural system. Some argue that it was largely a top-down system of control, with the pharaohs dictating the course of agriculture. Others believe that there was a more decentralized approach, with local leaders playing a significant role in overseeing farming activities. However, one thing is certain: the agricultural system of Egypt wouldn't have been as successful without the careful management of its infrastructure, from canals and dikes to granaries and storage facilities. These structures helped ensure that Egypt's economy remained robust and that its people could rely on a steady food supply. In the grand scheme of things, it wasn't just the land or the tools that made Egypt's agricultural system work. It was the careful planning and execution of an intricate network of infrastructure that supported every aspect of farming. Whether it was distributing water across the fields or storing grain for future use, the Egyptians built a system that allowed their civilization to thrive for thousands of years. The structure of ancient Egypt certainly supported their agricultural success. It's important to also recognize the social and cultural dynamics that played an essential role in shaping their farming practices. The ancient Egyptians didn't just work the land. Their entire society was structured around agriculture, and it permeated every aspect of their lives, from religious beliefs to social organization. The relationship between farmers, their land, and their gods created a deeply intertwined system of labor, belief, and ritual that ultimately sustained Egypt for millennia. Let's start by examining the social structure. The pharaoh, at the top of the social pyramid, was viewed as a living god. However, beneath the pharaoh was a class of individuals responsible for organizing and overseeing agricultural activity. These were the scribes, officials, and priests, and their role in agriculture cannot be overstated. The scribes, for example, kept meticulous records of agricultural activities, ensuring that the flow of crops into the granaries, the work done in the fields, and the collection of taxes were accurately documented. They played an essential role in managing Egypt's agricultural surplus and making sure that resources were allocated efficiently, especially in times of need. These records were also vital in organizing the complex system of labor that helped sustain Egyptian farming. Priests, too, held an important role in farming, not just as spiritual leaders, but as land managers. Many temples owned vast stretches of land, which were worked by farmers in exchange for spiritual protection and blessings. This arrangement was a symbiotic one. Priests performed rituals and offerings to the gods, believing that their actions ensured the success of crops and the health of the Nile. In return, the temples managed the lands and provided sustenance for their workers. This system of temple-owned land effectively made religion a critical part of the economic structure. It meant that agriculture wasn't just about food production. It was also deeply tied to the spiritual health of the nation. If you were a farmer in ancient Egypt, your life would have revolved around the farming calendar, which was shaped by the rhythms of the Nile. The year was divided into 3 primary seasons: inundation, planting, and harvest. The flood season, known as Aket, was when the Nile overflowed, bringing fertile silt to the fields. Farmers would use this time to prepare their land and perhaps focus on building or maintaining infrastructure like canals and dikes. The planting season, called Perit, was when the seeds were sown into the fertile soil. typically in the cooler months after the floodwaters had receded. Finally, the harvest season, known as Shemu, was the culmination of the entire year's work when the crops were gathered and stored in the great granaries. This rhythm of the year wasn't just about the physical work, it was also tied to rituals and festivals. Each season had its own set of religious festivals, often dedicated to gods and goddesses associated with agriculture, like Osiris, the god of fertility and the afterlife, and Hapi, the god of the Nile's inundation. These festivals, while celebratory, also had a very practical side. They marked important moments in the agricultural cycle, such as the start of planting or the end of harvest. During these celebrations, offerings would be made to the gods, prayers would be offered for a bountiful harvest, and the people would gather to give thanks for the abundance that the Nile provided. The Egyptians believed that their prosperity was directly linked to the favor of the gods, and their farming success was a reflection of their spiritual health. You could almost imagine the sound of chanting priests echoing across the fields, the air heavy with incense, as the people worked in tandem with the divine forces they believed controlled the land. Rituals weren't just about appeasing gods. They were deeply woven into the fabric of daily life, providing the spiritual motivation and communal bonding that kept Egyptian society functioning smoothly. The role of women in farming is another fascinating aspect to consider. While ancient Egypt was a patriarchal society, women weren't excluded from agricultural labor. In fact, they played an important role in planting, harvesting, and food processing. Women were often responsible for activities like grinding grain into flour, baking bread, and preparing food for the household. They also tended to the livestock, ensuring that the animals were well fed and healthy. Women had a central role in ensuring that agricultural production extended beyond the fields to the preparation of food for daily life and religious festivals. Historians still debate the degree of gender inequality in ancient Egypt, with some arguing that women had significant rights and freedoms compared to their counterparts in other ancient civilizations. Regardless, the work of women in the agricultural process was vital for the survival and functioning of Egyptian society, ensuring that the food produced in the fields reached the people, nourished them, and allowed them to continue their labor. But perhaps one of the most crucial aspects of the agricultural system was the labor force. Egypt's agricultural economy was based on both the labor of permanent farmers and the temporary laborers who were recruited to help during peak periods. During the flood season, many farmers would be recruited for public works, such as building the infrastructure we've already discussed, or working on large-scale construction projects for the state, like the pyramids. These workers were often not slaves, as is commonly assumed, but rather part of the Egyptian system of corvée labor, which was essentially a form of tax. Instead of paying money, people would pay taxes with their labor. During the harvest and planting seasons, they returned to their farms to tend to their crops. This system allowed Egypt to function as a highly organized and highly productive society. The relationship between the people, the land, and the state was one of mutual dependency. The farmers worked the land, paid their taxes in labor or grain, and in return, they received protection from the state and the favor of the gods. This system not only provided sustenance for Egypt's vast population, but also allowed the government to direct massive resources into monumental projects like the pyramids, temples, and palaces. Historians still argue whether the amount of labor required for these projects was sustainable in the long term, particularly when Egypt was undergoing periods of political or environmental strain. But in its prime, Egypt's agricultural and labor systems were the backbone of one of the most prosperous civilizations in history. The fusion of agriculture, labor, religion, and state organization created a sustainable, resilient system that would endure for thousands of years. The agricultural system in ancient Egypt was vast, intricate, and deeply embedded in both the practical and spiritual life of the people. But no system, no matter how ingenious, is immune to the forces of nature or the unforeseen changes in the world around it. While Egypt's agricultural success was the envy of neighboring civilizations, the kingdom was not without its challenges. We've touched on how they managed the water, soil, and labor. But now, let's take a moment to consider the farming calendar, a vital component in ensuring Egypt's agriculture functions smoothly year after year. In ancient Egypt, the farming year was structured around three primary seasons, each of which played a distinct role in the agricultural cycle. These seasons were not just markers of time, but also the foundation of their entire farming system. The ancient Egyptians had a deep understanding of the land and its cycles, and their farming calendar ensured they maximized the potential of every inch of soil, every drop of water, and every hour of labor. The first season, Akhet, was the time of inundation, the period when the Nile River would overflow, flooding the fields and replenishing the soil with the vital silt. This was the time when Egypt's agriculture would essentially rest. Farmers didn't spend their days planting or harvesting, but focused on preparing for the coming year. Fields would be cleared, canals maintained, and irrigation systems would be set up to distribute the floodwaters. It was also a time when laborers could be recruited for public works, such as the construction of temples or monumental structures like the pyramids. Despite the abundance that the inundation brought, Akhet wasn't without its risks. Floods could be too light, leaving the land parched and barren, or they could be too heavy, washing away crops or even damaging the irrigation systems. In those times, famine would follow, and the agricultural community would suffer, especially the poor farmers whose livelihoods depended on the Nile's yearly rise. This meant that every year, the Egyptians faced an element of uncertainty. The Nile's power wasn't something they could control. It was a force of nature that required their careful adaptation. Historians still debate how much the Egyptians understood the exact mechanics of the Nile's flood cycle. Some suggest they were aware of the river's rise due to moon phases and star patterns, which might have allowed them to predict the floods with surprising accuracy. While they couldn't always control the river, they could plan around it, ensuring that they were ready for whatever nature threw at them. The unpredictability of the floods, however, added a layer of tension to the calendar, as the people lived with the knowledge that their survival depended on the river's timing. Then came the second season of the year, Peret, the season of planting. This was when the floodwaters receded, and the Egyptians worked their land, planting crops like wheat, barley, and flax in the rich, silt-filled soil. The farmers would also plant vegetables, fruit trees, and other staple crops, as making sure that the fields were fully utilized during this time. The cool weather of Peret made it an ideal time for planting, as it allowed the crops to establish their roots before the heat of summer arrived. During this season, the Egyptians carefully organized the planting of their crops based on the water availability, the type of soil, and the specific needs of the crop. It wasn't just about sowing the seeds. They had to be strategic in how they planted to ensure that the crops would have enough nutrients, space, and water to grow. With the floodwaters now drained and the soil soft, they used simple yet effective tools like hoes and plows to prepare the fields for planting. The labor force was also most active during Peret, with farmers working long days to ensure that every crop was given the attention it needed. The third season marked the time of harvest, when the crops were ready to be gathered. The Egyptians worked tirelessly to reap the fruits of their labor, using sickles to cut the stalks of wheat and barley, gathering the produce that had been grown with so much care and effort. The harvest was a time of celebration, but it was also the most intense time of the year. After the hard work of planting and tending, the harvest was a time of reward, when the abundance of the land could be enjoyed. But, as with the other seasons, there were risks. If there was a drought or the soil had been overworked, the crops might not yield as much as expected. And as historians have pointed out, Egypt's agricultural economy was extremely sensitive to these kinds of fluctuations. Too little rainfall or too many pests could quickly turn a good harvest into a bad one. And the work didn't stop with the harvest. Farmers also needed to store the grain safely, ensuring that it wouldn't spoil and that there would be enough for the next season. The granaries, which we've discussed, were essential to ensuring that surplus grain didn't go to waste. For the Egyptians, the farming calendar was more than just a way of organizing time. It was a spiritual and symbolic structure that governed their entire agricultural system. The seasons were seen as a reflection of the gods' blessings, with the flood of the Nile representing the tears of the goddess Isis, mourning her lost husband, Osiris. The planting season was a time of hope and renewal, while the harvest was a time to give thanks for the bounty provided by the gods. This cyclical view of time, where each season flowed into the next, creating a never-ending loop of birth, growth, death, and rebirth, was deeply embedded in the Egyptian worldview. It mirrored the way the Egyptians understood the afterlife, where life and death were seen as interconnected and cyclical. The cycle of the Nile, the cycle of the seasons, and the cycle of life and death were all part of a larger cosmic order that the Egyptians believed they were part of. Historians still argue about how much the Egyptians were driven by their religious beliefs in their farming practices, with some suggesting that practical considerations were just as important as spiritual ones. Others, however, argue that the spiritual connection to the land was integral to their success, providing not just physical sustenance, but also a sense of purpose and identity that tied the people to the land and the gods. At the end of the day, Egypt's farming calendar wasn't just a way to keep track of time, it was a powerful reminder of how deeply intertwined agriculture was with Egyptian life. From the floodwaters of the Nile to the labor of planting and harvesting, the rhythms of the land were inextricably linked to the rhythms of Egyptian society. It wasn't just about growing food. It was about creating a sustainable, harmonious way of life that ensured the continued prosperity of Egypt for thousands of years. Look deeper into the structure of ancient Egyptian farming, we must also consider the critical aspect of grain storage and preservation. While the land was fertile and the water was managed expertly, without an efficient means of storing and protecting the crops once harvested, the entire agricultural system would have been at risk. Grain was Egypt's main food staple, and its preservation was absolutely crucial for surviving through droughts, poor harvests, or any other disruptions that might have threatened the food supply. Imagine this. After a long and grueling harvest season, the fields are bare, and the bounty of wheat and barley has been gathered in large, overflowing piles. The grain is still warm from the fields, its sweet, earthy scent lingering in the air as workers begin the long process of storage. The grain had to be properly sorted, cleaned, and protected from the elements, especially from pests which could quickly ruin an entire year's worth of harvest. The Egyptians had to be meticulous in how they stored their grain, ensuring that it would remain viable throughout the year. The primary means of storage were granaries, large, purpose-built structures designed to keep grain safe and dry. These granaries were often constructed from mud brick or stone, and their design was highly practical. They were raised off the ground on columns to prevent moisture from seeping into the stored grain, and to protect it from rodents or other pests. The grain would be placed into these storage areas in large ceramic jars, sacks, or baskets, stacked carefully to ensure airflow and prevent spoilage. The raised design of the granaries also helped keep the contents cool during the hot Egyptian summers. These granaries were not only used to store grain for consumption, but also played a critical role in managing the economic stability of the Egyptian state. Since grain was a form of currency, it was used to pay workers, soldiers, and officials. The state's ability to store and manage large amounts of grain ensured that food was available for the population and that the labor force required for monumental projects, such as the construction of pyramids, temples, and other state-sponsored works, would always be well fed. This system of food storage was one of the cornerstones of Egypt's economic power. The Egyptian government, specifically the viziers and their appointed officials, would keep track of the grain reserves using a highly detailed system of record keeping. These records would document how much grain had been harvested, how much was stored in each granary, and how much had been distributed. It was a sophisticated system that ensured there were always reserves to rely on during lean times. Historians still marvel at how effective this system was, considering the technology and tools available to the Egyptians at the time. The precision with which they recorded and managed their grain resources was a remarkable feat of organization. But grain wasn't the only agricultural product that needed to be preserved. The Egyptians also cultivated fruits, vegetables, and herbs, many of which were stored in similar ways to ensure they could be used year-round. For instance, dates, figs, and pomegranates were dried and stored in baskets, while vegetables like onions and garlic were often stored in cool, dry places to prevent spoilage. The ability to preserve these foods meant that the Egyptians could continue to rely on a diverse diet throughout the year, even when seasonal crops weren't in production. This preservation of food was especially crucial when it came to trade. Egypt's agricultural surplus was a significant part of its economy, and it was used to trade with neighboring civilizations like the Mesopotamians, Canaanites, and Greeks. Grain, flax, and other agricultural products were highly prized commodities, and Egypt's ability to produce and store vast amounts of food allowed it to become a regional economic powerhouse. As Egypt traded with other nations, it not only exported surplus crops, but also imported items like timber, metals, and luxury goods. This exchange created a network of trade routes that stretched across Africa and the Near East, connecting Egypt to the broader ancient world. However, Egypt's reliance on grain was also a double-edged sword. While it provided economic prosperity, it also made the country highly vulnerable to anything that could disrupt the grain supply. A bad harvest, a shift in the Nile's flooding patterns, or even a military conflict could send the entire agricultural system into a tailspin. And while Egypt's agricultural methods were highly sophisticated, no amount of grain storage could fully shield the country from the occasional crop failure. As a result, there were periods in Egypt's history where famine and food shortages led to social unrest, with people taking to the streets in protest against the ruling elite. Historians still debate how much Egypt's reliance on grain led to its downfall during certain periods. Some believe that the empire's stability was directly tied to the success of its agricultural system, and any disruption in food production contributed to political instability. Others argue that external factors, such as invasions or changing climate conditions, played a larger role. Still, the need to ensure that grain was carefully managed and preserved speaks to just how crucial agriculture was to Egypt's survival. Grain wasn't just food, it was the foundation of the economy, the lifeblood of the population, and the key to sustaining the culture, politics, and religion of ancient Egypt. This focus on grain storage and preservation wasn't just a matter of practicality, it was also intertwined with Egypt's religious beliefs. The process of storing grain was often accompanied by rituals and offerings to the gods, particularly Osiris, the god of fertility, agriculture, and the afterlife. Osiris was often depicted with grain or surrounded by agricultural symbols, reflecting the Egyptians' belief that their harvests were blessings from the gods. The preservation of grain was seen as a sacred duty, and the prosperity of the land was thought to be directly linked to the gods' favor. As a result, these rituals were not just a way of securing food for the future, they were a way of ensuring divine protection and prosperity for the nation. With all this in mind, we see how deeply intertwined agriculture was with every aspect of Egyptian society, from politics and economics to religion and daily life. The preservation of grain, along with the careful management of land and water, ensured that Egypt could endure the challenges of both nature and human endeavor. The grain stored in Egypt's vast granaries wasn't just a measure of food security, it was a symbol of Egypt's ability to adapt, thrive, and prosper for thousands of years. The agricultural prowess of ancient Egypt was a product of not only sophisticated techniques and tools, but also an intricate web of trade, technology, and cultural beliefs that allowed the civilization to prosper for centuries. However, Egypt's agricultural system didn't just exist in a vacuum. It was deeply connected to the broader Mediterranean and Near Eastern trade networks that spanned vast regions and played a crucial role in Egypt's economic and political influence. By exporting its agricultural surplus, Egypt not only ensured its own prosperity, but also became a key player in the exchange of goods, knowledge, and culture between civilizations. Picture this: the sun setting over the Nile, the banks bustling with activity as boats loaded with grain, flax, and papyrus are prepared for transport. Traders, merchants, and officials are busy securing shipments, while dock workers load the goods onto sturdy wooden vessels. These boats, capable of navigating the narrowest parts of the Nile and even venturing out into the Mediterranean Sea, were vital in ensuring that Egypt's agricultural bounty could reach distant lands. The food, textiles, and raw materials Egypt produced were highly sought after in other parts of the ancient world, and trade allowed Egypt to sustain its population while accumulating wealth and influence. One of the most notable commodities Egypt traded was grain. Wheat and barley were the staple crops, but Egypt also produced surplus flax, from which linen was made. Linen became highly prized not just for its practical uses in clothing, but also for its cultural and religious significance. Linen was used to wrap mummies and in temple rituals, making it a key product that found demand beyond Egypt's borders. Papyrus, too, was a sought-after export, as it was used for writing, essential for record-keeping and administrative purposes, and was in high demand in places like Mesopotamia and the Greek and Roman empires. Historians still debate how much Egypt's prosperity during its peak was due to its agricultural surplus versus its role as a trade hub. However, it's clear that Egypt's ability to produce surplus crops, thanks to the fertility of the Nile and the agricultural systems we've discussed, gave it a strong bargaining chip in trade. The Egyptians didn't just trade raw materials, though. They also exchanged knowledge and cultural practices with neighboring civilizations. The sharing of agricultural techniques, technologies, and ideas created a rich environment for cross-cultural exchange. Take the Mesopotamians, for example. They had their own sophisticated farming practices, but their irrigation systems were based on different techniques and challenges. The Egyptians, with their more predictable flooding and fertile silt, might have shared techniques related to water management and the control of floodwaters. Conversely, the Mesopotamians might have had expertise in things like crop rotation and canal engineering, which the Egyptians could have adapted. This type of mutual exchange helped both civilizations improve their agricultural methods, creating a more interconnected world. In addition to sharing techniques, trade networks allowed for the exchange of luxury goods, items that weren't directly related to agriculture, but were essential to Egyptian elites. Items like gold, ivory, and exotic animals were traded for agricultural products and goods like linen and papyrus. These luxury items were often used in religious ceremonies, royal tombs, and the creation of stately monuments. The importation of these goods reflected Egypt's position as a wealthy, thriving society that could afford to partake in the luxuries of the ancient world, further consolidating its influence. But Egypt's agricultural system didn't just benefit the elite and the merchants. It played a role in military conquest as well. The surplus of grain and other agricultural products allowed Egypt to maintain a strong and well-fed military. Armies need food, and Egypt's ability to supply its forces with grain and other provisions allowed it to expand and defend its borders. Egypt's military conquests also allowed it to control vital trade routes, ensuring that agricultural products could flow freely to the markets of the ancient world. The relationship between agriculture, economy, and military power was vital to maintaining Egypt's position as one of the great powers of the ancient world. But trade wasn't always a smooth-sailing endeavor. At times, Egypt faced competition and conflict over access to fertile lands, strategic routes, and trade goods. As Egypt expanded its reach, particularly under the New Kingdom, it came into contact with powerful neighbors like the Hittites, the Mitanni, and the Kushites. These civilizations also had agricultural bases and their own trade routes, which led to conflicts over territory, resources, and access to markets. Egypt's ability to maintain its agricultural surplus while defending its borders was a delicate balance. Military campaigns were often initiated not just for territorial control, but also to secure access to crucial agricultural land and trade routes. Despite these challenges, Egypt managed to maintain a relatively stable agricultural system for much of its history. Political stability, reinforced by agricultural wealth, meant that Egypt could focus on monumental projects like the building of the pyramids, temples, and palaces. These projects required enormous labor forces, but they were also a way of demonstrating the power of the pharaohs, whose authority was tied to their ability to manage Egypt's agricultural wealth. The royal administration, with its sophisticated systems of land management, taxes, and grain storage ensured that the agricultural surplus was used to fuel the broader ambitions of the state. Historians still argue about the ultimate causes of Egypt's decline. Some suggest that Egypt's agricultural system, with its dependence on the Nile's annual floods and reliance on the same few crops, made the civilization vulnerable to shifts in climate or changes in the river's behavior. Others point to the political instability that came with weak rulers, external invasions, and economic downturns as contributing factors. Still, the agricultural system itself, if maintained properly, remained one of the most effective in the ancient world. When Egypt could no longer manage the delicate balance between agriculture, politics, and military power, its once great civilization began to slowly decline. Trade, agriculture, and military conquest were all interconnected, and the strength of each depended on the others. Egypt's agricultural prowess allowed it to become a key player in the ancient world, feeding its population, supporting its military, and generating wealth for trade. The story of Egypt's agricultural success is one of careful planning, resilience, and a keen understanding of the land and its rhythms. It's a story that reminds us of the power of nature, the importance of sustainable practices, and the ways in which civilizations can grow and thrive through ingenuity, collaboration, and perseverance. Egypt's agricultural success was undoubtedly tied to its relationship with the Nile. The civilization's advancements went far beyond just managing water and soil. Agricultural tools and techniques were a critical part of this success, and over the centuries, the Egyptians honed their craft, developing increasingly sophisticated methods that would influence farming practices for centuries to come. The tools used in ancient Egypt were designed to complement the land and the natural environment, reflecting an intimate understanding of the resources available and the work needed to sustain Egypt's agricultural system. As we've already seen, the shaduf was one of the most iconic inventions, revolutionizing the way water was moved for irrigation. But it wasn't the only tool that shaped Egypt's farming practices. The Egyptians also developed a variety of plows, hoes, and sickles to work the land, each tailored to specific tasks. These tools weren't just functional, they were a key part of the agricultural rhythm, crafted with precision and care to ensure efficiency and productivity. Plows were essential for breaking up the soil, creating furrows that would allow seeds to be planted deeply and securely. Early Egyptian plows were typically made of wood with a metal tip and were pulled by oxen. These tools were far less advanced than modern tractors, but in their time, they were ingenious. The simple but effective design of the plow allowed the Egyptians to till large areas of land, preparing it for planting in a fraction of the time it would take using hand tools. This was especially important during the short planting season when every day counted. The role of hoes can't be overlooked either. These tools were used extensively for weeding, leveling the soil, and ensuring the crops had enough space to grow. With a flat blade, the hoe helped break up compacted soil and removed unwanted vegetation that could drain nutrients from the crops. It's easy to imagine a laborer working in the fields under the sun, the rhythmic motion of the hoe cutting through the earth. While simple, this tool had an incredible impact on the efficiency of Egypt's agricultural system. Then there were the sickles, the tools used for harvesting crops once they had ripened. With their curved blades, the sickle allowed workers to cut through the stalks of wheat, barley, and other grain crops quickly and efficiently. The sickle's design made harvesting faster, allowing the workers to collect large amounts of crops in a short amount of time. This was crucial during the harvest season, as the crops had to be gathered before they were damaged by pests or spoiled by the hot desert sun. It's likely that the sound of the sickles cutting through the grain would have filled the air during harvest time, signaling the success of another season's hard work. Of course, tools were only part of the story. The Egyptians also developed a number of agricultural techniques that allowed them to maximize the potential of their land. One of the most important was crop rotation, a practice that is still widely used in modern agriculture. The Egyptians understood that planting the same crops in the same soil year after year could lead to the depletion of essential nutrients. To combat this, They rotated their crops, planting different species in different fields each year. This method helped to preserve soil fertility and ensure that the land remained productive over the long term. By alternating between nitrogen-fixing crops like legumes and staple crops like wheat and barley, the Egyptians were able to maintain a balance that sustained their agricultural output. The concept of organic fertilization was also central to Egyptian farming. They used animal manure to enrich the soil, returning vital nutrients that had been used up by previous crops. The dung from livestock like cows, goats, and sheep was carefully collected and spread across the fields. This practice of fertilizing the soil with natural materials helped maintain the health and productivity of the land without the need for artificial chemicals. The animals themselves played a crucial role in Egypt's agriculture, providing not only fertilizer but also labor for plowing and irrigation. It was a delicate balance where animals, humans, and the land worked together in a cycle of mutual benefit. Another technique the Egyptians employed was irrigation. While we've already talked about the use of canals and basins to manage the flow of water, the Egyptians also understood how to use the water from the Nile in highly efficient ways. In addition to their famous shaduf, they also used water wheels and other devices to move water to areas that weren't directly served by the Nile's flooding. These water wheels could be used to lift water from the river into channels that fed distant fields, ensuring that even the most remote parts of the land had access to the vital liquid. This type of innovation helped Egypt create a consistent and reliable agricultural output, even during dry periods. Interestingly, while the Egyptians were known for their impressive engineering feats, they also had a deep connection to superstition and religious ritual. Agriculture was viewed as a gift from the gods, and the Egyptians believed that maintaining proper rituals and ceremonies was key to ensuring bountiful crops. Hapi, the god of the Nile's inundation, was especially important in agricultural rituals. The annual flood of the Nile was seen as a direct blessing from Hapi, and the Egyptians would perform ceremonies to honor him and ask for a good flood, which would bring fertile silt to the fields. The success of the harvest was directly linked to the pharaoh's ability to keep the gods pleased, and agricultural success was seen as a reflection of divine favor. Historians still debate how much these rituals actually influenced the success of the crops, or whether the Egyptians' practical farming techniques were the primary reason for their success. While there's no denying that religious rituals were deeply ingrained in Egyptian society, it's also clear that their agricultural knowledge was far ahead of its time. The Egyptians may have combined science and superstition, but in doing so, they created a system that sustained their civilization for millennia. In the end, the agricultural success of ancient Egypt was not just about managing land or water, but about creating a system of tools, techniques, and knowledge that worked together in harmony. The Egyptians' understanding of farming was as sophisticated as any modern system, and their innovations in irrigation, crop rotation, fertilization, and tool-making laid the foundation for agricultural practices that continue to shape our world today. Continue to explore the immense agricultural legacy of ancient Egypt, it's important to consider the broader social and economic impact of their farming practices. Egypt's ability to sustain such a large, prosperous civilization was not just a result of the physical farming techniques, tools, and technologies, but also due to the way agriculture was woven into the very fabric of Egyptian society. The link between agriculture and the Egyptian economy is crucial to understanding how the civilization maintained its power and influence over millennia. It's also essential to appreciate the ways in which farming practices underpin both the political stability and the cultural identity of the Egyptians. At the heart of Egypt's agricultural system was the concept of land ownership. While the land itself belonged to the pharaoh, it was distributed to various segments of society through a system of land grants. The highest-ranking officials, including priests and the military elite, were granted plots of land to manage and cultivate. These land grants were typically given in exchange for services rendered to the state, such as military service or administrative duties. Farmers who worked these lands were either part of a corvée labor system, where they were required to work for the state, or were tenants who paid a portion of their harvest as rent. The majority of Egypt's agricultural workers were peasant farmers who worked the land for their living. Though they did not own the land they worked on, they played a vital role in maintaining the agricultural system. These workers were often tied to the land through taxes, which could be paid either in labor or in the form of a portion of the crops they grew. This system ensured that Egypt's political and religious leaders had access to the agricultural output of the land, while also providing for the working class. As we've seen, the surplus grain produced was not just for local consumption, it played a pivotal role in Egypt's trade with neighboring civilizations. The state's ability to control the grain supply was directly tied to the political power of the pharaoh. By managing the grain reserves and ensuring the agricultural system ran smoothly, the pharaohs were able to maintain order and ensure stability across the kingdom. The collection of taxes through the harvests and corvée labor was a way of securing Egypt's prosperity and preventing food shortages. During times of war, famine, or political instability, the pharaoh's control over food production became more critical. The strategic distribution of grain from state-controlled granaries could be used to appease the population or feed soldiers during military campaigns. One of the key elements that made Egypt's agricultural system so effective was its ability to sustain its workforce. Large-scale projects, such as the construction of the pyramids, temples, and cities, required a massive labor force, and agriculture was at the center of providing for these workers. While many of the workers were laborers hired for specific projects, the majority were farmers who worked on state-sponsored projects during the off-season, when their fields weren't actively being cultivated. During this period, the demand for food would increase because of the need to feed these workers, so the efficient storage and distribution of grain were essential. The state also ensured that food would be readily available by diversifying its agricultural output. Beyond the basic staples of grain, Egypt also grew fruits and vegetables like onions, garlic, leeks, and lentils, which formed part of the regular diet. Flax was another key crop, which the Egyptians processed into linen. Linen was used for clothing, for wrapping mummies, and for other textile-based products, making it a highly valued commodity both within Egypt and for export. Papyrus, too, was a product that resulted from Egypt's land and water management. Used for making paper and writing materials, it became one of Egypt's most important exports, contributing to Egypt's economic influence and facilitating record-keeping and communication. But Egypt's wealth didn't only come from what was grown, it also came from the control of vital trade routes. The Nile, of course, served as Egypt's lifeline for transport, but Egypt's trade routes stretched beyond the river's shores. The trade network spanned regions like the Levant, Mesopotamia, and Nubia, and Egypt traded goods like grain, linen, and papyrus for luxury goods and materials they couldn't produce themselves, such as timber, precious metals, and exotic animals. Egypt's control over its agricultural production gave it the leverage to negotiate favorable trade deals, enhancing the wealth and power of the state. Religion also played an enormous role in how agriculture was viewed and practiced in Egypt. The agricultural cycle was linked to the divine, and the gods were believed to control everything from the flooding of the Nile to the success of crops. As mentioned before, Hapi, the god of the Nile, was considered the deity responsible for the floods that made agriculture possible. Osiris, the god of fertility and agriculture, was central to the religious rituals tied to farming, particularly in the context of the afterlife. The rituals associated with these deities were thought to ensure that the land remained fertile and that the crops would flourish. Farmers performed regular rituals and prayers to appease the gods, seeking divine favor to guarantee that the harvest would be bountiful. These rituals were not just about superstition. They were a vital part of maintaining the cultural and spiritual health of the community. The practice of linking agriculture with spirituality created a sense of unity within Egyptian society, as it reinforced the idea that the success of their crops was directly tied to the gods' blessings. Festivals, offerings, and prayers were as much a part of the farming year as the physical labor of sowing, irrigating, and harvesting. This symbiotic relationship between agriculture and religion helped to solidify the pharaoh's role as a divine figure. The pharaoh, seen as the living god, was responsible for maintaining harmony with the gods and ensuring the prosperity of the land. The successful harvest, the controlled flooding of the Nile, and the abundance of grain were seen as a reflection of the pharaoh's favor with the gods and his ability to manage the country's agricultural wealth. Therefore, agriculture wasn't just about food production. It was deeply tied to Egypt's political stability and the pharaoh's legitimacy as ruler. Historians still debate the impact of religion on the day-to-day practices of agriculture. Some believe that religious beliefs were just a means of social control, while others argue that they served a deeper, spiritual purpose that tied the people to the land and to the divine forces that controlled it. What's clear, however, is that the role of agriculture in ancient Egypt went far beyond the physical act of farming. It was intertwined with the cultural, political, and spiritual life of the Egyptian people, making it an essential part of their identity. Continue to unpack the complex relationship between agriculture and Egyptian society, it's essential to turn our attention to how agricultural knowledge was preserved, passed down, and utilized across generations. The ancient Egyptians weren't just relying on trial and error. They had a highly sophisticated understanding of the land, the seasons, and the best practices for cultivating crops, managing water, and ensuring soil fertility. This knowledge was passed down through various means, including written records, oral traditions, and the involvement of specialized agricultural workers. One of the most fascinating aspects of Egyptian agriculture was the use of papyri, the earliest form of paper, made from the papyrus plant. These papyri were used for everything from documenting administrative work and trade transactions to preserving agricultural records and instructions. The Egyptians developed a complex system of writing, using hieroglyphs to record agricultural information. These records could include everything from the quantities of grain harvested, the locations of storage granaries, and the details of labor forces assigned to irrigation and plowing, to the exact timing of planting and harvesting. Historians have uncovered papyri that describe detailed farming techniques and provide insight into how ancient Egyptians managed their agricultural practices. For example, the Ebers Papyrus, which dates to around 1500 BCE, includes references to agricultural practices, including the use of herbal remedies to protect crops from pests. These records serve not only as administrative tools, but also as valuable sources of knowledge, guiding farmers in the proper methods of crop management. The use of papyrus for documenting agricultural information was key to ensuring the continuity of farming practices from one generation to the next. In addition to papyri, oral traditions played a significant role in passing agricultural knowledge. Elders, farmers, and local experts would have shared wisdom passed down through generations, teaching the younger members of society how to read the land and understand the changing rhythms of the seasons. There was a deep connection between the community and the land, and as such, farming was often seen as a communal activity where knowledge and skills were shared. Farmers would have worked together during planting and harvesting seasons, exchanging tips and advice, and relying on one another's expertise. Moreover, Egypt's religious institutions played a key role in preserving agricultural knowledge. Priests, who often managed large estates and agricultural lands, were responsible for overseeing farming operations in temples and other religious establishments. The temple economies were significant sources of agricultural wealth, and priests had access to extensive records of crop production, labor, and resources. These religious leaders were also well versed in the rituals and prayers associated with the agricultural cycle, ensuring that the spiritual side of farming was integrated with its practical application. One of the major reasons why Egypt's agricultural knowledge persisted for so long was its centralized administration. The viziers, the high-ranking officials appointed by the pharaoh, played a crucial role in overseeing the farming operations of the country. They managed the distribution of land, ensured that irrigation systems were functioning properly, and coordinated the harvests. The administrative system in Egypt was highly organized, which allowed for the efficient management of resources, labor, and information. This organizational framework ensured that agricultural practices were carried out consistently and that new techniques or adjustments to existing methods were implemented quickly across the kingdom. Historians still argue about how much of Egyptian agricultural knowledge was influenced by foreign civilizations. Some scholars suggest that Egypt's farming techniques might have been shaped by contact with neighboring civilizations, like Mesopotamia and Nubia, while others believe that Egypt developed its agricultural practices independently, driven by the unique geography and climate of the Nile. Regardless, Egypt's ability to integrate foreign knowledge while maintaining its distinct agricultural identity was key to its long-lasting success. Egypt's isolation, for much of its history, allowed its agricultural system to evolve independently, but it was also open to learning and adapting the best practices from neighboring cultures when necessary. The temple archives and the role of scribes cannot be overstated in understanding how agricultural knowledge was preserved. The scribes were not only responsible for keeping detailed records of agricultural outputs and labor distributions, but also for making sure that the knowledge contained in papyri was accurately passed on. These scribes acted as both the record keepers and the educators, passing down their knowledge to the next generation of scribes and priests. Without this vast and sophisticated record-keeping system, much of Egypt's agricultural wisdom could have been lost to time. Another key way Egyptian agricultural knowledge persisted was through royal decrees and state-sponsored education. The pharaohs and their officials often decreed that certain agricultural practices, particularly those related to the construction of irrigation systems and the management of grain reserves, should be passed down to the workers. These decrees would often be accompanied by a code of conduct for the agricultural community, ensuring that farming methods were standardized across the kingdom. The hieroglyphic inscriptions found on monuments, temples, and tombs often include references to the state's role in supporting agriculture and the ways in which the pharaohs ensured that farming was carried out according to specific guidelines. Egypt's agricultural knowledge wasn't just practical, it was also intertwined with its philosophical and religious values. The idea that the land was a divine gift, maintained and nurtured by the gods, imbued the act of farming with spiritual significance. Osiris, the god of fertility, and Hapi, the god of the Nile, were central figures in this religious worldview. The fertility of the land was seen as a reflection of the god's favor, and the agricultural cycle was believed to mirror the cyclical nature of life, death, and rebirth. The continuity of this spiritual connection to the land helped ensure that agricultural practices remained central to Egyptian identity for thousands of years. Historians continue to explore how the integration of practical knowledge and religious beliefs helped Egypt maintain its agricultural system for so long. The ancient Egyptians understood the relationship between nature, divinity, and agriculture in a way that ensured the land remained fertile and productive. Even as their empire eventually fell to external invaders, the legacy of their agricultural innovations, their tools, and their knowledge of the land continue to influence farming practices in the Mediterranean world for centuries to come. Ultimately, the preservation and dissemination of agricultural knowledge were pivotal in sustaining ancient Egypt's agricultural success. Through a combination of papyri, oral traditions, temple management, and state-sponsored education, the Egyptians were able to ensure that their farming techniques were passed down and adapted across generations. This knowledge formed the backbone of Egypt's agricultural system, enabling the civilization to thrive for thousands of years and leave an indelible mark on the history of human agriculture. Word count. Tools, techniques, and knowledge that drove ancient Egypt's agricultural success, it's now essential to explore how Egypt's agricultural innovations and practices influenced the wider ancient world. Egypt's mastery over its natural resources, most notably the Nile River, set it apart from its contemporaries, and its farming techniques would leave a lasting impact on civilizations that followed. The influence of Egyptian agriculture extended beyond just their immediate neighbors. It shaped the agricultural practices of the Mediterranean, the Near East, and even parts of Africa. One of the most significant contributions Egypt made to the world of agriculture was the understanding of irrigation systems. Egypt's use of canals, basins, and water wheels to control the flow of the Nile's waters was revolutionary. While many ancient civilizations had to rely on rain-fed agriculture, Egypt's farmers were able to work with the predictability of the Nile's annual flooding, utilizing water management systems that allowed them to maximize crop yields. These innovations became models for neighboring regions. For instance, Mesopotamians to the east, who lived between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, faced similar challenges with their water supply. Though they developed their own irrigation techniques, historians believe that Egypt's agricultural systems, particularly their canal systems, influenced the development of similar systems in Sumer, Babylonia, and later in Persia. The ancient Egyptians may not have directly shared their knowledge with Mesopotamians, but the success of their systems likely prompted their neighbors to create their own versions. Both civilizations shared the challenge of managing water, and Egypt's success in harnessing the Nile's flooding may have provided a model for improving irrigation practices in regions with unpredictable river cycles. Additionally, Egypt's crop rotation and use of natural fertilizers were highly influential. The Egyptians' practice of rotating crops to maintain soil fertility, along with the use of animal manure and organic compost, was far ahead of its time. While Mesopotamians and other agricultural societies also used organic materials, the Egyptians' approach to using manure to enrich the soil and their sophisticated crop rotations likely contributed to the agricultural practices adopted by the ancient Greeks and Romans. Moving westward, Egypt's influence on Mediterranean agriculture is clear. The Greeks and later the Romans admired Egypt's agricultural methods and learned from them, especially with regard to irrigation and crop management. Greek historians such as Herodotus often wrote about the fertility of Egypt and its reliance on the Nile's waters, and these writings inspired future generations of agriculturalists. The Romans, who controlled Egypt after it became a province of the Roman Empire, adopted many of Egypt's methods for managing irrigation and crop cultivation. Under Roman rule, Egypt's agricultural output was integrated into the broader Roman economy, and the Romans relied on Egypt's grain supply to feed their armies and cities. In fact, Egypt was often referred to as the breadbasket of Rome due to its vast grain production. The Roman Empire relied heavily on Egyptian wheat to sustain its population, particularly during times of military expansion and conquest. The efficient storage and management of grain, along with the advanced irrigation techniques developed by the Egyptians, made it possible for Egypt to sustain such a vast empire. The Roman agricultural model, in turn, was influenced by Egyptian practices and spread across the Mediterranean world, including to North Africa, Spain, and Gaul. Egypt's agricultural techniques also influenced regions south of Egypt in Nubia and the Horn of Africa. Egypt's dominance over Nubia, particularly during the New Kingdom, meant that Egyptian agricultural practices were likely adopted by the Nubians. Additionally, Egypt's influence extended into the Kingdom of Kush, which often had close cultural and trade ties with Egypt. The agricultural methods employed by Egypt were probably passed down and integrated into these regions, contributing to the sustainability of their own civilizations. The agricultural methods of Egypt didn't just impact ancient civilizations, they also had a profound effect on modern agricultural techniques. Egypt's careful management of water resources and land, especially in times of limited rainfall and erratic flooding, laid the groundwork for modern irrigation systems. The use of water wheels, basins, and canals in ancient Egypt served as an inspiration for later irrigation technologies in both the Islamic Golden Age and in European farming practices during the Middle Ages. The principles of crop rotation, manure as fertilizer, and the efficient use of land are still relevant in modern farming. What's remarkable is that many of the innovations Egypt pioneered are still in use today, particularly in arid regions of the world. Egypt's ability to turn a desert environment into a fertile land with the use of irrigation and careful land management influenced modern-day farming techniques in places like the Middle East, Central Asia, and even parts of North America. Beyond the practical influence of agricultural practices, Egypt's cultural and spiritual relationship with the land also left an indelible mark. The Egyptians viewed agriculture as a sacred act, a gift from the gods. This belief, coupled with their sophisticated understanding of the natural world, led to a deep respect for the cycles of the land. Their belief in divine intervention in agricultural productivity through the worship of gods like Osiris and Hapi set the tone for agricultural cultures in neighboring regions. Other ancient civilizations adopted similar beliefs, linking agricultural cycles to religious festivals and rituals. Interestingly, the role of the pharaoh as both a political and religious leader, who ensured the success of Egypt's agricultural system, also became a model for later monarchies and empires. The idea that the ruler was responsible for the fertility of the land and the prosperity of the people was central to Egyptian thought and found expression in later Mesopotamian, Persian, and even European monarchical systems. The symbolism of the king or emperor as the divine steward of the land has resonated across cultures for millennia. Historians continue to explore how Egypt's agricultural influence permeated other ancient civilizations, as well as its lasting impact on modern farming and political structures. The sophistication of Egyptian agriculture, along with its integration into the broader political and economic systems of the ancient world, helped Egypt become one of the longest-lasting civilizations in history. The influence of Egypt on agriculture serves as a testament to how agricultural innovations, when combined with effective water management, knowledge preservation, and the careful stewardship of the land, can sustain a civilization for thousands of years. As we move into the modern age, Egypt's agricultural legacy is still with us, embedded not only in the techniques we use today, but also in the cultural importance of farming and the reverence for the land that continues to shape the world we live in. As we reflect on the long-lasting impact of ancient Egypt's agricultural legacy, it becomes increasingly clear that sustainability was at the core of their farming practices. The Egyptians didn't just focus on maximizing short-term yields. They worked to create an agricultural system that could endure for generations, despite the challenges posed by their environment. In many ways, their approach to farming is a model for modern agricultural systems, particularly in terms of balancing human needs with the health of the environment. The Egyptians had a profound understanding of the delicate relationship between nature and farming. They realized that the key to a successful agricultural system wasn't simply controlling the elements, but working with them. The annual flooding of the Nile was a prime example of this. While the flood could bring both blessings and challenges, the Egyptians understood that they had to adapt to the river's cycles, working within nature's rhythms rather than trying to impose their own. This flexibility and ability to adjust to shifting conditions allowed them to maintain agricultural success over long periods of time. The concept of crop diversity also played a major role in Egypt's sustainable farming practices. Unlike civilizations that relied heavily on monoculture, Egypt grew a wide range of crops, from grains like wheat and barley to vegetables such as onions and garlic, as well as fruits like dates and figs. This diversity not only ensured a more varied diet, but also helped prevent the depletion of the soil. By rotating crops and using different plants to enrich the soil, Egypt's farmers maintained soil health over time, helping to preserve the fertility of the land. In addition to crop diversity, the Egyptians understood the importance of natural fertilization. As we've already discussed, they used animal manure to enrich the soil, keeping it fertile without the need for artificial chemicals or synthetic fertilizers. This sustainable approach to soil management meant that the land could produce consistently year after year, ensuring food security for Egypt's population and preventing the kind of environmental degradation that plagued many other ancient civilizations. However, sustainability wasn't just about the health of the land. It also encompassed the socio-economic systems that supported it. The Egyptians maintained a careful balance between the needs of the population and the resources available. The grain storage systems that we've discussed ensured that surplus crops could be kept in reserve, helping the people weather times of drought or poor harvests. The surplus grain also allowed Egypt to engage in trade, exchanging agricultural products with neighboring civilizations for goods that couldn't be grown in Egypt. This trade system helped sustain Egypt's economy, while its agricultural abundance became a symbol of its wealth and stability. The labor force also played a crucial role in maintaining this balance. The ancient Egyptians relied on a mix of seasonal laborers, skilled agricultural workers, and slaves to cultivate the land and maintain the irrigation systems. While some laborers were conscripted for large-scale state projects like the construction of the pyramids, many others worked the land and ensured the stability of the agricultural system. The ability to mobilize a labor force for both agricultural work and monumental construction projects was essential for maintaining the kingdom's prosperity and political power. In addition to these practical measures, the Egyptians also had a profound spiritual connection to their land and farming practices. This spiritual connection reinforced their commitment to maintaining balance and harmony with the environment. The gods were believed to be directly involved in the fertility of the land, and the success of the harvest was seen as a reflection of divine favor. The annual flood of the Nile was interpreted as a manifestation of the god's will, and the pharaoh, as a divine ruler, was responsible for ensuring the people's relationship with the gods was maintained. This spiritual aspect of farming gave the Egyptians a sense of purpose and guided their farming practices. Historians still debate the role of spirituality in Egyptian agriculture. Some argue that it was merely a means of social control, while others believe that the Egyptians truly believed their success in farming was divinely inspired. What is clear, however, is that this connection between spirituality and farming contributed to a deeper sense of community, solidarity, and commitment to sustainable practices. The Egyptians were not just farming for food, they were farming as part of a broader cosmic order that linked their success in agriculture to their relationship with the gods. In terms of modern relevance, the Egyptians' emphasis on sustainable farming practices offers valuable lessons for us today. The modern world faces a growing demand for food, alongside concerns about environmental degradation, climate change, and the depletion of natural resources. As we move forward, we can draw on the ancient Egyptians' respect for natural cycles, their use of organic methods to enrich the soil, and their understanding of the importance of water management in building resilient agricultural systems. These are lessons that have stood the test of time and can still be applied in our contemporary agricultural practices. Looking at the challenges the Egyptians faced with flooding and drought, it is clear that their ability to adapt to environmental changes was a key factor in their long-term agricultural success. The modern world, too, must learn to adapt to the changing climate, finding sustainable ways to increase agricultural productivity while minimizing environmental harm. Egypt's experience reminds us that it's not just about maximizing output, it's about maintaining a healthy, balanced relationship with the land. The Egyptians also understood the importance of community in farming. Their cooperative approach to managing the land, working together to irrigate fields, plant crops, and harvest, created a strong sense of social cohesion. This sense of unity, driven by both necessity and shared religious belief, helped sustain the agricultural system and ensure its success. In today's world, there's growing recognition of the importance of community-based agriculture, a model where small-scale farmers work together to produce food in a way that promotes sustainability, food security, and resilience. In essence, the Egyptians understood the interconnectedness of all aspects of their agricultural system: soil, water, labor, and belief. Their success was not just a result of technological innovations, but of a deep respect for the natural world and a system that allowed all aspects of society to contribute to agricultural production. It was a model of sustainability, where agriculture was viewed not only as a means of survival, but as a way of maintaining balance between humanity and the earth. As we reflect on Egypt's agricultural legacy, we realize that many of their practices and principles are just as relevant today as they were thousands of years ago. Their ingenuity, adaptability, and respect for the land provide valuable lessons for addressing the challenges we face in modern agriculture. In this way, The agricultural practices of ancient Egypt continue to offer insight, wisdom, and inspiration for building a more sustainable future. Explore the incredible agricultural system of ancient Egypt, it's important to understand the decline of their agricultural system and the factors that contributed to its eventual downfall. Despite the unparalleled success of Egyptian farming for thousands of years, several external and internal factors led to a gradual decline in agricultural productivity and ultimately the weakening of Egypt's political power. Let's start with the biggest force working against Egypt: climate change. Though Egypt had long thrived with the predictable flooding of the Nile, changes in climate began to affect the region. Evidence from paleoclimatic studies suggests that over time, the Nile's flooding became less predictable and less intense. While the Nile's annual flood was once the lifeblood of Egyptian agriculture, there is evidence suggesting that over centuries, the river's inundation became increasingly erratic. When the Nile's floodwaters were lower, Egypt's farmland would suffer. Crops like wheat and barley, which the civilization relied on for sustenance, would fail, and the storage of surplus grain could not always prevent famine. It is worth noting that irrigation systems, like canals and basins, were originally designed to manage the floodwaters when they came, but these systems were far less effective when the river's natural rhythms were disrupted. As a result, Egypt faced increasing difficulty in maintaining its agricultural output. Fewer crops meant less food for the population, and this imbalance likely contributed to political instability, as the social and economic structure of Egypt was deeply tied to its agricultural success. In addition to changes in the climate, Egypt faced external invasions that affected both its agricultural infrastructure and its overall political stability. As Egypt became wealthier and more powerful, it attracted the attention of neighboring civilizations, some of whom saw Egypt as a prime target for conquest. The Hyksos, a Semitic-speaking people from the Near East, invaded Egypt around 1700 BCE and took control of the Nile Delta. This invasion not only destabilized Egypt politically, but also had a direct impact on agricultural production. While the Hyksos were eventually driven out, their invasion, along with subsequent military campaigns and invasions by other groups like the Libyans and the Assyrians, further damaged Egypt's agricultural infrastructure, disrupting irrigation systems and leading to agricultural decline. The internal social structure also played a role in Egypt's agricultural struggles. Over time, Egypt's centralized government, which had been highly effective in managing agricultural resources, began to weaken. The pharaohs, once seen as divine rulers who ensured the fertility of the land, became less able to maintain control over the agricultural system. This weakened authority may have resulted in the mismanagement of irrigation systems, poorly managed grain reserves, and a general decrease in agricultural productivity. Additionally, Egypt's labor force, which had relied on a mix of seasonal workers and enslaved individuals, began to face challenges. The corvée labor system, which had been essential for maintaining Egypt's large-scale agricultural projects, became less effective as political instability increased. The ability to mobilize labor for irrigation, canal maintenance, and crop management became more difficult, contributing to a reduction in agricultural output. Over the centuries, Egypt's reliance on monoculture farming, particularly on wheat and barley, also became a vulnerability. While the Egyptians were highly skilled in producing these staple crops, their over-reliance on them made the kingdom more susceptible to environmental shifts. For example, when the floods of the Nile were lower than usual, or when the soil became over-farmed, the lack of crop diversity left Egypt with fewer options to sustain its population. This lack of flexibility, combined with a strained irrigation system and labor shortages, contributed to the overall decline in agricultural productivity. The decline in agriculture also had economic consequences. Egypt's wealth had been built on its ability to produce surplus crops and trade them with neighboring civilizations. With agricultural output diminishing, Egypt could no longer rely on its agricultural exports to fuel its economy. Egypt's grain, linen, and papyrus were no longer in sufficient quantities to support both local needs and trade, leading to an economic slowdown. Additionally, As Egypt's agricultural system became less stable, its trade routes became more vulnerable to attacks from rival civilizations. As Egypt's economic power weakened, so too did its military strength, leading to further vulnerabilities on the international stage. Despite these challenges, Egypt's agricultural legacy persisted long after the civilization itself began to fade. Many of the techniques developed by the Egyptians, particularly those related to irrigation, crop management, and water conservation, were passed on to future generations. Even though Egypt's political and military dominance waned, the knowledge of sustainable farming practices, developed over thousands of years, continued to influence subsequent civilizations. The agricultural practices of the Greeks, Romans, and even later Islamic empires were built upon the foundations laid by the Egyptians. Today, scientists and archaeologists study the ancient Egyptian agricultural systems to uncover more about their techniques and their sustainability. There is a growing interest in how the Egyptians managed water resources in a region that is naturally arid, and how their understanding of crop rotation and soil management can offer insights into modern sustainable farming. In an age where many societies face climate change and diminishing resources, the ancient Egyptians' ability to balance human needs with environmental conditions serves as a powerful model for future agricultural practices. The legacy of ancient Egypt's agricultural system reminds us that sustainability and innovation go hand in hand. While their farming methods may have eventually succumbed to changes in climate and political instability, the principles of respecting the land, managing resources carefully, and maintaining a balance between nature and human need offer timeless lessons. The Egyptians showed that the health of the land is directly tied to the health of a civilization, and their remarkable achievements in agriculture remain a testament to their ingenuity, resourcefulness, and deep understanding of the natural world. Section 19. As we continue to explore the fascinating journey of ancient Egyptian agriculture, it's essential to take a moment to understand the cultural and historical significance of farming practices in shaping Egypt's identity. Egypt's unique ability to harness the power of the Nile and transform its environment for agriculture not only supported the civilization's survival, but also served as the foundation for its entire cultural and societal structure. From monumental architecture to religious practices, agriculture was intricately woven into the very identity of Egypt. The relationship between the Nile and Egypt's identity cannot be overstated. For the ancient Egyptians, the Nile was not just a river. It was a divine presence, a gift from the gods that brought fertility and prosperity. As the lifeblood of Egypt's agriculture, it shaped not only the landscape, but the way Egyptians saw themselves in relation to the cosmos. The annual flooding of the Nile was viewed as a cycle of death and rebirth, mirroring the religious and cultural themes of the afterlife that permeated Egyptian thought. This cyclical view of nature, where death precedes rebirth, was essential not only for farming, but for understanding the eternal nature of the universe. The flooding of the Nile was symbolically linked to the rejuvenation of the land, much like the resurrection of the gods and the pharaohs. Agriculture, therefore, wasn't just a practical necessity, it was also a sacred activity. The connection between farming and religion was so deep that rituals and prayers were integral to every aspect of agricultural life. The cult of Osiris, for example, was one of the most important religious practices in Egypt. Osiris, the god of fertility and agriculture, was believed to be directly responsible for the growth of crops and the renewal of the earth each year. His story, in which he is killed, buried, and reborn, mirrored the life cycle of the crops, and his death and resurrection were celebrated annually in agricultural festivals. Farmers would offer prayers to Osiris, asking for a bountiful harvest and for protection from famine. The idea of the pharaoh as a divine figure also reinforced the connection between agriculture and leadership. The pharaoh was not only the political ruler of Egypt, but was also seen as the earthly representative of the gods. It was believed that the pharaoh's ability to maintain harmony with the gods directly influenced the fertility of the land. The success of Egypt's farming system was therefore intertwined with the pharaoh's ability to manage the kingdom, provide for its people, and maintain the divine order. In this way, agriculture played a key role in legitimizing the pharaoh's rule and ensuring the prosperity of the state. The symbolism of grain also held cultural significance beyond its role as a food staple. Grain was seen as a symbol of life and prosperity. The pharaohs were often depicted with grain or wheat stalks in their hands or as part of their regalia, underscoring the importance of agriculture in Egypt's social structure. Grain offerings were a central aspect of religious ceremonies, presented to gods as a form of gratitude for their blessings. In tombs and burial sites, grain was placed in the hands of the deceased, symbolizing the continuity of life and the hope for a fertile afterlife. This symbolic association between grain and life would leave an indelible mark on Egyptian art and literature. Egyptian art and architecture were also heavily influenced by agriculture. Many of the great monuments and temples that dotted the landscape of Egypt were dedicated to agricultural gods and were designed to reflect the agricultural bounty of the land. Temples were often surrounded by agricultural estates and granaries, symbolizing the importance of farming to the spiritual and economic well-being of Egypt. Iconography associated with agriculture, such as sheaves of grain, plows, and irrigation channels, frequently appeared in temple reliefs and tomb paintings, reflecting the deep reverence the Egyptians had for the agricultural process. Perhaps one of the most enduring cultural symbols of Egypt's agricultural might is the Great Pyramid of Giza. While the pyramid was a tomb for the pharaoh, it was also a testament to the prosperity that Egypt's agricultural system allowed. The construction of such a monumental structure required vast resources, including grain to feed the laborers who built it. The wealth generated by Egypt's agriculture made such grand projects possible, and the pyramid's completion was seen as a symbol of the harmony between the divine, the agricultural system, and the pharaoh's authority. Historians still debate the extent to which the Egyptian economy relied solely on agriculture, or whether other economic activities, such as mining or trade, played an equally important role. However, the sheer scale of agricultural output and its essential role in sustaining both Egypt's population and its monumental endeavors suggests that agriculture was the cornerstone of Egypt's power and influence. From the fertile soil of the Nile to the complex systems of irrigation, storage, and trade, Egypt's agricultural success allowed it to not only survive but thrive for thousands of years. Moreover, the profound connection between agriculture and Egyptian education cannot be overlooked. Egyptian scribes were trained in the management of agricultural data, including the measurement of land, the recording of harvests, and the distribution of resources. Papyri containing agricultural records have been discovered in tombs, revealing how Egyptian scribes kept meticulous records of crop yields, labor forces, and grain reserves. These records were not only a practical necessity, but were also deeply intertwined with Egypt's bureaucratic and religious systems. The ability to accurately record and manage agricultural information allowed Egypt to thrive in an era when most other civilizations struggled with food security and resource management. The enduring legacy of Egyptian agriculture, therefore, extends far beyond its agricultural innovations and technologies. It is a story of how agriculture shaped culture, religion, and society. The Egyptians' ability to combine their deep knowledge of farming with their spiritual reverence for the land and its resources created a society where agriculture was not only a means of survival, but a foundational aspect of their worldview. Their success in maintaining a sustainable, productive agricultural system for thousands of years is a testament to their ingenuity, respect for nature, and their belief that the land was a gift from the gods. As we look at modern agricultural systems today, we can learn much from the Egyptians' approach to sustainability, resource management, and the deep connection between the land and the people. The lessons from Egypt's agricultural system remind us that farming is not just about producing food. It is about fostering a deeper understanding of our place in the natural world and the importance of maintaining balance and harmony between the land, its people, and the divine forces that govern the earth. Further into Egypt's agricultural story, we encounter one of the most remarkable aspects of their success, the system of trade. that grew directly from the abundance and reliability of their agricultural output. Agriculture was the backbone of Egypt's economy, but it was also the foundation for the complex trade networks that Egypt established with its neighbors and beyond. These networks not only allowed Egypt to sustain itself, but also to become a key player in the ancient world, connecting Egypt to distant lands, cultures, and goods. At the heart of Egypt's trade system was its grain surplus. With a highly efficient agricultural system, Egypt could produce more grain than it needed to feed its population. This surplus allowed Egypt to participate in long-distance trade, which was a critical part of its economy. Egypt's grain exports were essential for sustaining the empires and kingdoms around the Mediterranean, and it became a crucial supplier of food for regions such as Mesopotamia, Greece, and Rome. Egypt's grain was highly prized for its quality, and this trade not only bolstered Egypt's wealth, but also solidified its role as a hub of commerce in the ancient world. The Nile River served as the primary highway for Egypt's internal and external trade. Boats loaded with grain, linen, papyrus, and other agricultural products would navigate the river, reaching trading posts and ports along the way. The river's steady flow and predictability made it an ideal trade route. From the bustling city of Thebes to the coastal port of Alexandria, Egypt's trade network expanded across vast distances, facilitating cultural exchange and economic growth. In addition to grain, Egypt was known for producing papyrus, which was exported throughout the ancient world. Papyrus was not just used for writing, it was highly valued for its durability and flexibility, making it the material of choice for scrolls, books, and various types of documents. The Egyptians were the first to develop the technique for making papyrus, and its widespread use made Egypt a center for literature, education, and record-keeping. This export gave Egypt a unique position in the ancient world, particularly in trade with the Greeks and Romans, who valued papyrus for everything from legal documents to literary works. Egypt's dominance in papyrus production allowed it to establish strong trading relationships, especially with civilizations that lacked the natural resources to produce their own writing materials. As Egypt's trade routes expanded, the kingdom's influence reached far beyond its borders. Egypt traded not only with its immediate neighbors, but also with far-flung regions such as Nubia to the south, the Levant to the northeast, and even parts of Asia Minor and the Indus Valley. These exchanges were not just about the exchange of goods, they were also cultural, technological, and intellectual exchanges. Egypt's influence on the surrounding world was felt through its agricultural products, its mastery of irrigation, its unique crops, and, perhaps most importantly, through its knowledge of writing and administration. Egypt's agriculture was also the basis for its military strength. The food produced by its fields fed the armies that allowed Egypt to expand its borders, control strategic regions, and defend its people. Egypt's agricultural surplus gave it the ability to maintain a standing army, which was essential for defending its land and resources from external threats. The ability to provide for its military with homegrown food meant that Egypt was less reliant on foreign supplies during times of war, further bolstering its military power. But it wasn't just food that Egypt traded. It was also the products derived from the land. Flax, for example, was cultivated extensively in Egypt and used to create linen, which became another highly sought-after commodity. Egyptian linen was known for its fine quality, and it was exported to a variety of civilizations that used it for clothing, trade, and ceremonial purposes. Linen was often used in Egypt's temples for sacred rituals, and it became an important trade item, contributing to Egypt's economic prosperity. Additionally, Egypt's agricultural wealth allowed it to import luxury goods, such as timber, gold, precious stones, and exotic animals from the regions it traded with. This flow of goods created a dynamic and diverse economy that helped Egypt maintain its wealth for centuries. The pharaohs, as the rulers of Egypt, played a pivotal role in overseeing trade and ensuring that it remained a source of prosperity for the kingdom. The pharaoh's influence extended beyond the domestic realm, as the ruler often took part in organizing trade expeditions and diplomatic missions to foreign lands. One of the most famous examples of this is the Queen of Sheba's visit to King Solomon, which is believed to have been part of a larger diplomatic and trade exchange between Egypt and the kingdoms of the Levant and Arabia. The importance of state-sponsored trade expeditions cannot be overlooked. For example, the Hatshepsut expedition to Punt, a region believed to be located in modern-day Somalia or Eritrea, is one of the most famous trade missions in Egyptian history. During her reign, Queen Hatshepsut sent an expedition to Punt to acquire myrrh, frankincense, and ebony, as well as exotic animals like giraffes. These trade missions not only brought valuable goods into Egypt, but also showcased the kingdom's power and reach. The trade of luxury goods and raw materials from places like Punt contributed to Egypt's cultural and economic influence, reinforcing the idea that agriculture was not just about growing food, but about feeding Egypt's political and economic systems. However, the complexities of Egypt's trade network were not without their challenges. As Egypt became more reliant on its agricultural surplus for trade, any disruption in its farming system, whether from internal political instability, changing climate conditions, or external invasions, had the potential to affect Egypt's ability to participate in global trade. Trade relations depended on Egypt's ability to produce enough surplus for itself and for export, and fluctuations in agricultural output could disrupt trade networks, causing economic instability. Historians still debate the extent to which trade affected Egypt's decline. Some argue that as Egypt's agricultural system became more strained due to external pressures and internal mismanagement, the kingdom's trade networks faltered, leading to economic instability. Others suggest that Egypt's military defeats and the loss of its regional dominance contributed more directly to the breakdown of its trade relationships. Regardless, it's clear that agriculture and trade were intimately connected, and the decline of one affected the other. When Egypt's agricultural system weakened, so too did its ability to engage in trade and maintain its position as a powerful, prosperous state. In modern terms, Egypt's agricultural trade system serves as a reminder of the importance of resource management and economic diversification. Today's world faces similar challenges in ensuring a stable food supply while maintaining robust trade relationships. The story of Egypt's agricultural rise and decline offers valuable lessons about the need for resilience, innovation, and sustainability in the face of both environmental and political challenges. Further into Egypt's agricultural story, we encounter one of the most remarkable aspects of their success, the system of trade that grew directly from the abundance and reliability of their agricultural output. Agriculture was the backbone of Egypt's economy, but it was also the foundation for the complex trade networks that Egypt established with its neighbors and beyond. These networks not only allowed Egypt to sustain itself, but also to become a key player in the ancient world, connecting Egypt to distant lands, cultures, and goods. At the heart of Egypt's trade system was its grain surplus. With a highly efficient agricultural system, Egypt could produce more grain than it needed to feed its population. This surplus allowed Egypt to participate in long-distance trade, which was a critical part of its economy. Egypt's grain exports were essential for sustaining the empires and kingdoms around the Mediterranean, and it became a crucial supplier of food for regions such as Mesopotamia, Greece, and Rome. Egypt's grain was highly prized for its quality, and this trade not only bolstered Egypt's wealth, but also solidified its role as a hub of commerce in the ancient world. The Nile River served as the primary highway for Egypt's internal and external trade. Boats loaded with grain, linen, papyrus, and other agricultural products would navigate the river, reaching trading posts and ports along the way. The river's steady flow and predictability made it an ideal trade route. From the bustling city of Thebes to the coastal port of Alexandria, Egypt's trade network expanded across vast distances, facilitating cultural exchange and economic growth. In addition to grain, Egypt was known for producing papyrus, which was exported throughout the ancient world. Papyrus was not just used for writing, it was highly valued for its durability and flexibility, making it the material of choice for scrolls, books, and various types of documents. The Egyptians were the first to develop the technique for making papyrus, and its widespread use made Egypt a center for literature, education, and record keeping. This export gave Egypt a unique position in the ancient world, particularly in trade with the Greeks and Romans, who valued papyrus for everything from legal documents to literary works. Egypt's dominance in papyrus production allowed it to establish strong trading relationships, especially with civilizations that lacked the natural resources to produce their own writing materials. As Egypt's trade routes expanded, the kingdom's influence reached far beyond its borders. Egypt traded not only with its immediate neighbors, but also with far-flung regions such as Nubia to the south, the Levant to the northeast, and even parts of Asia Minor and the Indus Valley. These exchanges were not just about the exchange of goods, they were also cultural, technological, and intellectual exchanges. Egypt's influence on the surrounding world was felt through its agricultural products, its mastery of irrigation, its unique crops, and, perhaps most importantly, through its knowledge of writing and administration. Egypt's agriculture was also the basis for its military strength. The food produced by its fields fed the armies that allowed Egypt to expand its borders, control strategic regions, and defend its people. Egypt's agricultural surplus gave it the ability to maintain a standing army, which was essential for defending its land and resources from external threats. The ability to provide for its military with homegrown food meant that Egypt was less reliant on foreign supplies during times of war, further bolstering its military power. But it wasn't just food that Egypt traded, it was also the products derived from the land. Flax, for example, was cultivated extensively in Egypt and used to create linen, which became another highly sought-after commodity. Egyptian linen was known for its fine quality, and it was exported to a variety of civilizations that used it for clothing, trade, and ceremonial purposes. Linen was often used in Egypt's temples for sacred rituals, and it became an important trade item, contributing to Egypt's economic prosperity. Additionally, Egypt's agricultural wealth allowed it to import luxury goods, such as timber, gold, precious stones, and exotic animals from the regions it traded with. This flow of goods created a dynamic and diverse economy that helped Egypt maintain its wealth for centuries. The pharaohs, as the rulers of Egypt, played a pivotal role in overseeing trade and ensuring that it remained a source of prosperity for the kingdom. The pharaoh's influence extended beyond the domestic realm, as the ruler often took part in organizing trade expeditions and diplomatic missions to foreign lands. One of the most famous examples of this is the Queen of Sheba's visit to King Solomon, which is believed to have been part of a larger diplomatic and trade exchange between Egypt and the kingdoms of the Levant and Arabia. The importance of state-sponsored trade expeditions cannot be overlooked. For example, the Hatshepsut expedition to Punt, a region believed to be located in modern-day Somalia or Eritrea, is one of the most famous trade missions in Egyptian history. During her reign, Queen Hatshepsut sent an expedition to Punt to acquire myrrh, frankincense, and ebony, as well as exotic animals like giraffes. These trade missions not only brought valuable goods into Egypt, but also showcased the kingdom's power and reach. The trade of luxury goods and raw materials from places like Punt contributed to Egypt's cultural and economic influence, reinforcing the idea that agriculture was not just about growing food, but about feeding Egypt's political and economic systems. However, the complexities of Egypt's trade network were not without their challenges. As Egypt became more reliant on its agricultural surplus for trade, any disruption in its farming system, whether from internal political instability, changing climate conditions, or external invasions, had the potential to affect Egypt's ability to participate in global trade. Trade relations depended on Egypt's ability to produce enough surplus for itself and for export, and fluctuations in agricultural output could disrupt trade networks, causing economic instability. Historians still debate the extent to which trade affected Egypt's decline. Some argue that as Egypt's agricultural system became more strained due to external pressures and internal mismanagement, the kingdom's trade networks faltered, leading to economic instability. Others suggest that Egypt's military defeats and the loss of its regional dominance contributed more directly to the breakdown of its trade relationships. Regardless, it's clear that agriculture and trade were intimately connected, and the decline of one affected the other. When Egypt's agricultural system weakened, so too did its ability to engage in trade and maintain its position as a powerful, prosperous state. In modern terms, Egypt's agricultural trade system serves as a reminder of the importance of resource management and economic diversification. Today's world faces similar challenges in ensuring a stable food supply while maintaining robust trade relationships. The story of Egypt's agricultural rise and decline offers valuable lessons about the need for resilience, innovation, and sustainability in the face of both environmental and political challenges. We turn our attention to the later stages of Egypt's agricultural story. It's crucial to consider the legacy of Egypt's agricultural practices and how they were preserved and adapted in the centuries following Egypt's decline as a dominant power. While Egypt eventually succumbed to foreign invasions, internal political turmoil, and economic instability, the agricultural knowledge it developed continued to influence the surrounding regions and the world far beyond its time. This legacy became an important foundation for subsequent civilizations, and in many ways, Egypt's agricultural innovations were key to the rise of other empires. The Hellenistic period, which began with Alexander the Great's conquest of Egypt in 332 BCE, marked a significant turning point. Alexander's successors, the Ptolemies, inherited Egypt's rich agricultural heritage and integrated it into their larger empire-building efforts. The Ptolemies, like their Egyptian predecessors, relied on the Nile's flooding to provide for the people and the state. The agricultural systems that had been perfected over millennia continued to function under the Ptolemies, with Egypt remaining a breadbasket for the Mediterranean world, supplying grain to Rome and other Greek-controlled territories. However, while the Ptolemies maintained many of Egypt's agricultural systems, the Greek influence gradually led to the integration of new agricultural techniques, ideas, and products that diversified the region's agricultural economy. One of the most notable changes during the Hellenistic period was the increased integration of Greek farming practices, which included the introduction of new crops such as olives, grapes, and figs into Egyptian farming. These crops became staple parts of Egypt's agricultural output and would go on to influence the broader Mediterranean world. Additionally, Greek advancements in irrigation techniques and engineering were incorporated into Egyptian farming practices, improving efficiency and expanding the range of lands that could be cultivated. These innovations laid the groundwork for future agricultural growth in Egypt, though Egypt's once dominant role as a sole supplier of grain began to shift as other Mediterranean regions began to emulate Egypt's practices. The Roman period, which followed the Ptolemies after Cleopatra's reign ended in 30 BCE, also saw Egypt retain its agricultural importance, though now as part of the vast Roman Empire. Rome's imperial economy relied heavily on Egypt's agricultural surplus to feed the growing population of Rome itself. The Romans, like the Egyptians before them, recognized the strategic importance of Egypt's grain fields, and the agricultural economy became even more tightly integrated into the empire's broader economic and military strategies. The Romans introduced new technologies, such as the use of water mills for grinding grain, which were a significant improvement over the older manual methods. However, the Roman Empire's extensive trade networks, combined with their increasing control over agriculture in Egypt, began to shift some of the power away from Egyptian farmers themselves. The elite in Egypt, both Roman and Egyptian, continued to control the agricultural resources, while the laboring class found itself increasingly under pressure. Egypt's social structure began to show cracks, and the once innovative agricultural systems that had built Egypt's wealth were now part of a larger, less sustainable global trade network. While Egypt continued to produce large quantities of grain, the relationship between the rural farmers and the elite became more exploitative. This created the backdrop for later agricultural instability. The introduction of Islamic rule in Egypt during the 7th century CE, after the Arab conquest, brought another significant shift in Egypt's agricultural systems. The Umayyads and later Abbasid caliphates brought new agricultural practices, which blended Egyptian and Islamic agricultural knowledge. The introduction of new irrigation systems, including the qanat, an underground channel for water, improved Egypt's ability to manage water resources efficiently and helped Egypt maintain its agricultural output. New crops, like citrus fruits, cotton, and rice, were introduced during this period, expanding Egypt's agricultural diversity and making it a major producer of various goods. The medieval Islamic period was a time of agricultural innovation in Egypt, as Islamic scholars, engineers, and farmers adapted Egyptian practices and combined them with broader Islamic agricultural knowledge. Crop rotation, advanced irrigation systems, and the use of organic fertilizers remained key components of Egypt's farming traditions. By this time, Egypt had become a crucial player in the Mediterranean and Near Eastern agricultural trade, and its markets were known for the abundance of products grown using sophisticated techniques inherited from the ancient Egyptians. However, like previous periods, Egypt's agricultural wealth was not without its challenges. The system continued to rely heavily on the Nile's flooding, and by the time of the Ottoman period, 16th to early 19th century, Egypt's agriculture was increasingly vulnerable to fluctuations in water levels, especially as the empire's central control weakened. The Ottoman Turks managed Egypt as part of their empire, but their methods of managing agriculture were less efficient than their predecessors, and many of Egypt's ancient irrigation systems fell into disrepair. As a result, Egypt's agriculture began to suffer, and food shortages became more common. Despite these challenges, Egypt's agricultural legacy remained important even through the modern era. In the 19th and 20th centuries, the Egyptian government, particularly under British colonial rule, 1882 to 1952, invested in modernizing the country's agricultural systems. Large-scale projects, such as the construction of the Aswan High Dam in the 20th century, allowed Egypt to regulate the flow of the Nile and improve irrigation, thus helping restore the agriculture of the land that had once made Egypt great. These modern irrigation systems are still critical to Egypt's farming practices today, as the country continues to rely on its agricultural sector for economic stability and food security. Modern Egypt's agricultural challenges, particularly with water scarcity and the effects of climate change, reflect some of the same issues that faced ancient Egypt. While the technology has changed dramatically, the fundamental principles of irrigation, soil management, and crop rotation that were pioneered by the ancient Egyptians still serve as a foundation for agriculture in Egypt today. The lessons learned from the ancient Egyptians' efforts to manage their agricultural resources, especially in the face of environmental and political instability, continue to resonate, offering valuable insights into how modern societies can address issues of sustainability, food security, and environmental management. Ultimately, Egypt's agricultural legacy reminds us that sustainable farming practices, resource management, and a deep connection between society and the land are timeless. From the Nile's floodwaters to the modern-day reliance on irrigation, Egypt's agricultural systems have not only shaped its own history, but have provided a blueprint for agricultural success and resilience in the face of changing environmental and political landscapes. As we reach the final chapters of this exploration into Egypt's agricultural legacy, it's essential to look at how Egypt's agricultural system has not only influenced modern practices, but also shaped the relationship between human civilization and the environment over the course of millennia. The Egyptians' careful management of their natural resources, especially water, soil, and labor, has set a precedent that resonates through history and continues to influence how we think about sustainable farming and resource use today. One of the most striking aspects of ancient Egyptian agriculture is the concept of resource stewardship. The Egyptians understood the importance of managing their environment in a way that would sustain not just their current needs, but also the needs of future generations. This long-term perspective is something that modern societies are increasingly coming to recognize as essential in the face of climate change and environmental degradation. While the Egyptians may not have had access to modern scientific knowledge, their practices were based on careful observation and a deep understanding of the natural world. They knew that the Nile was a finite resource, that the soil could only be farmed sustainably if managed carefully, and that the natural cycles of the environment had to be respected to maintain balance. In modern times, this respect for natural cycles is especially important as we face the challenges of increasing industrialization, urbanization, and globalization. The Egyptians' ability to balance technological advancement with environmental care is something that can be applied to contemporary sustainability efforts. They didn't exploit their land and water resources without thought of the consequences. They used what was available to them, took care of it, and ensured that it would continue to support them. This sense of responsibility is something that modern societies need to embrace as they grapple with the impact of climate change, overexploitation of land, and the loss of biodiversity. As we look to the future of agriculture, the Egyptians that have careful water management systems provide a critical lesson. Egypt's irrigation technologies, from shadows to large-scale canals and water wheels, allowed them to effectively control the flow of water and ensure crops flourished in one of the world's driest climates. Today, irrigation technologies like drip irrigation and smart water management systems are crucial in areas that suffer from water scarcity, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa, the Middle East, and parts of Asia. The techniques pioneered by the Egyptians are being adapted and modified to meet modern demands for water-efficient farming, proving that their ancient systems continue to have relevance. Egypt's use of organic fertilization, using manure from livestock to enrich the soil, was another key aspect of their sustainability. While modern farming techniques often rely on chemical fertilizers, the Egyptians were already using naturalized organic materials to keep their soil healthy. This method, which we would now call organic farming, helped prevent soil depletion and ensured long-term productivity. Today, there is a growing movement towards organic agriculture as people become more aware of the environmental and health impacts of synthetic fertilizers. The principles that the Egyptians developed, including the use of natural materials to maintain soil fertility, offer an important model for modern farmers seeking to balance high yields with environmental sustainability. Moreover, the Egyptians' emphasis on crop diversification also holds valuable lessons for modern agriculture. By cultivating a variety of crops, wheat, barley, flax, vegetables, and fruit, the Egyptians ensured that they weren't entirely dependent on any one crop. This not only helped maintain soil health, but also provided a buffer against crop failure. In today's agricultural landscape, monoculture farming, where large areas are dedicated to a single crop, has led to soil degradation and vulnerability to pests and diseases. The Egyptians' practice of rotating crops, using leguminous plants to fix nitrogen in the soil, and growing a variety of crops is a strategy that modern farmers are now revisiting in an effort to reduce the environmental impacts of monoculture farming. One of the most profound lessons that Egypt offers in terms of agriculture is its integration of farming with culture, religion, and politics. In Egypt, agriculture wasn't just about feeding people, it was interwoven with their worldview, beliefs, and governance. The annual flooding of the Nile, which brought fertility to the land, was seen as a divine act of renewal, and the rituals around this process gave people a sense of connection to the land and the gods. This sacred view of farming helped the Egyptians maintain a sustainable agricultural system for thousands of years. In modern times, there is a growing recognition of the need for agriculture to be culturally meaningful and spiritually enriching. Communities around the world are beginning to embrace the idea that farming is not just about producing food, it's also about building a deeper connection with the land and recognizing the spiritual importance of food systems. Agroecology, for example, combines traditional farming knowledge with modern sustainability practices to create systems that are not just environmentally responsible, but also culturally relevant and spiritually significant to the people who practice them. In this way, the ancient Egyptian model of integrating agriculture with cultural and spiritual life offers valuable insight into the holistic approach that can lead to more sustainable and equitable food systems today. Egypt's agricultural legacy also underscores the importance of preserving local knowledge and traditional farming methods. As the world faces the challenges of feeding a growing population while protecting the environment, it's crucial to look back at the wisdom of civilizations like Egypt, who successfully managed their agricultural systems for millennia. In many parts of the world, traditional farming knowledge is being lost in the rush for modern, industrialized farming methods. However, organizations like Slow Food International and the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations, FAO, are working to revitalize traditional farming techniques that prioritize sustainability, community, and biodiversity. Finally, as we look to the future, Egypt's agricultural history reminds us that agriculture is at the heart of human civilization. From its earliest roots in the fertile banks of the Nile to the global agricultural trade networks it helped establish, Egypt's farming practices laid the foundation for modern agriculture and food systems. The Egyptians' ability to manage land, water, and resources, combined with their respect for the divine connection to the earth, helped them create a civilization that not only thrived for thousands of years, but also left behind a legacy that still influences our agricultural practices today. By revisiting the principles of sustainability, resource management, and cultural integration that the ancient Egyptians embodied in their farming practices, modern societies can begin to build a future where agriculture supports both the planet and its people in a harmonious and balanced way. Egypt's agricultural achievements show that when we work with nature, respect its rhythms, and invest in sustainable practices, agriculture can be both a source of abundance and a pathway to a more sustainable and connected world. Reach the final section of this journey through ancient Egypt's agricultural history, it's essential to reflect on the broader lessons we can draw from the Egyptians' approach to farming and its enduring relevance today. The core principles they established, rooted in sustainability, community, and careful resource management, offer a model for modern societies striving to address the environmental and social challenges of our time. Their ability to balance technological innovation with respect for nature is a lesson that continues to resonate, not just in agriculture but across all aspects of life. The Nile River, which served as the foundation of Egypt's agriculture, was not just a river, it was a symbol of the delicate balance between human intervention and natural processes. The Egyptians' sophisticated management of water through systems like canals, basins, and reservoirs exemplified how humans can work with the environment rather than against it. Today, this concept of managing natural resources wisely remains as important as ever. The modern world faces a host of water challenges, from droughts to water scarcity, and Egypt's ancient methods of controlling and storing water offer a model of efficiency that could inform contemporary solutions. Moreover, the Egyptians' ability to maximize crop production without overexploiting the land offers another powerful lesson. Their practice of crop rotation, careful soil management, and use of organic fertilizers help to maintain soil fertility for generations. Today, as industrial agriculture often leads to soil degradation, Egypt's agricultural practices remind us of the importance of nurturing the land. Modern methods such as no-till farming, composting, and the use of organic materials are all rooted in principles that the Egyptians pioneered. These techniques provide a way to build soil health and ensure long-term agricultural productivity without relying on harmful chemicals that degrade both soil and human health. One of the most notable aspects of Egypt's agricultural system was its integration with religion and culture. Agriculture wasn't seen as just a means of survival, it was a sacred duty tied to the divine order. The Egyptians believed that their ability to grow food was a blessing from the gods, and farming was regarded as a way to maintain balance in the world. This spiritual connection to agriculture helped foster a deep respect for the land and its resources. As modern societies grapple with issues like climate change and resource depletion, reconnecting with nature on a cultural and spiritual level could help us foster a deeper sense of responsibility for the land and its well-being. Today, sustainable agriculture is more than just a buzzword, it's a necessity. As the world faces mounting challenges related to food security, environmental degradation, and social inequality, The principles that guided Egypt's agricultural system offer a blueprint for addressing these problems. The Egyptians demonstrated that sustainability is not just about producing enough food, it's about producing food in a way that respects the environment, supports communities, and preserves resources for future generations. In modern times, much of the world's food systems are characterized by the industrialization of farming, where efficiency and yield are prioritized above all else. This system, while effective in feeding large populations, often comes at the expense of environmental health, worker rights, and community well-being. The Egyptians, by contrast, embraced a more balanced approach where agricultural success was intertwined with social, spiritual, and environmental harmony. This holistic vision offers valuable insight as we look to build food systems that are both productive and sustainable. The Egyptians also understood the critical role of community in maintaining agricultural success. Their reliance on collective labor, where workers came together to irrigate fields, plant crops, and harvest produce, created a sense of shared responsibility. This spirit of collaboration was key to the resilience of their agricultural system. In the modern world, where farming often relies on individual or corporate ownership, the idea of community-based agriculture is gaining traction. By prioritizing cooperation over competition and fostering stronger ties within local food systems, we can create more resilient, equitable agricultural practices. Local food systems are already seeing a resurgence, with many communities around the world embracing urban farming, community gardens, and farm-to-table initiatives. These movements draw from ancient practices where food was grown and consumed locally, and they promote sustainability, food security, and community resilience. The Egyptians understood the importance of providing for their people while also ensuring that the land remained productive for future generations. Today, as we face increasing challenges of food insecurity and climate change, these models of localized sustainable agriculture offer a pathway forward. The story of ancient Egypt's agriculture also reminds us of the importance of adaptability. The Egyptians didn't have access to modern technology, but they were remarkably innovative in how they adapted to their environment. They learned to harness the unpredictable flooding of the Nile and to work within the limits of their land and climate. Today, adaptability is just as critical as it was for the Egyptians. As climate change continues to affect agricultural systems worldwide, the ability to adapt through the adoption of new farming practices, the use of sustainable technologies, and the development of resilient crops is key to ensuring a stable food supply. Looking at Egypt's agricultural history, it becomes evident that sustainability is a long-term process. It's not just about the immediate benefits of food production, but about creating systems that can withstand changing conditions, environmental challenges, and socioeconomic shifts. The Egyptians, in their infinite wisdom, understood that their agricultural success depended on their ability to respect natural rhythms, work with the environment, and share resources equitably. These principles continue to resonate today as we search for ways to feed a growing global population while also protecting the planet for future generations. As we move forward, the challenge of feeding the world in a way that is both sustainable and equitable will require innovation, cooperation, and a deep respect for the natural world, qualities that were at the heart of Egypt's agricultural legacy. By drawing from the lessons of the past, we can shape a future where agriculture not only meets our needs, but also contributes to the well-being of the planet and its people. In conclusion, the story of ancient Egypt's agriculture is more than just a chapter in history. It's a blueprint for the future. The principles of sustainability, resource management, and community that the Egyptians cultivated offer timeless lessons for tackling the complex challenges of modern agriculture. As we continue to confront global issues like climate change, food insecurity, and environmental degradation, Egypt's agricultural legacy remains an invaluable guide to building a more resilient, sustainable world. Word count. As we reach the final section of our journey through the history of Egypt's agricultural legacy, it's important to slow down and reflect on the enduring wisdom embedded in their farming practices. The agricultural system that Egypt developed over millennia deeply interwoven with their culture, religion, and politics, not only ensured the survival of one of the world's greatest civilizations, but also continues to inspire modern agricultural thinking. Today, we live in a world where the pressures of globalization, climate change, and population growth are creating urgent challenges in food security and sustainability. But if we look back at Egypt, we can find powerful lessons about resilience, adaptability, and long-term sustainability, principles that remain as relevant now as they were thousands of years ago. The Egyptians mastered the delicate balance between human ingenuity and the natural environment, making them pioneers in creating a truly sustainable agricultural system. They worked with the forces of nature rather than against them. The annual flooding of the Nile, for example, was an uncontrollable force, but the Egyptians turned it into an advantage by developing sophisticated irrigation systems to control and direct the floodwaters. These systems, which included canals, dikes, and basins, allowed Egypt to use the Nile's water to flood fields and deposit fertile silt, making the land incredibly productive. While the Egyptians didn't have access to modern technology, their practical knowledge and innovative solutions allowed them to build an agricultural system that sustained their civilization for thousands of years. One of the most important lessons we can take from Egypt's agriculture is their ability to adapt to their environment. The Egyptians didn't have the luxury of being able to choose their climate or geography, yet they developed methods to work with the harsh environment of the Egyptian desert. In fact, the ancient Egyptians' ability to adapt is reflected not just in their agricultural practices, but in the way they used the land to support one of the world's most prosperous civilizations. Irrigation, crop rotation, and fertilization were all methods used by the Egyptians to maintain soil health and increase agricultural productivity. These practices, which are now foundational to modern organic farming, were central to Egypt's long-term agricultural sustainability. This ability to innovate and adapt is something that modern societies must emulate in the face of climate change, especially as we look for ways to grow food more sustainably without exploiting the land. The Egyptians also understood the importance of community in agriculture. Their farming system was built on cooperation and shared responsibility. Farmers worked together to manage irrigation, plant crops, and harvest, knowing that the success of one was tied to the success of all. This communal approach to farming not only ensured the survival of Egypt's agricultural system, but also fostered a sense of solidarity and connection among the people. In today's world, we face increasing urbanization and the breakdown of traditional agricultural communities. However, as the global food system faces rising inequality and environmental crises, there is a growing interest in the return to community-based agriculture. Movements like community-supported agriculture, CSA, and local food networks reflect the same values of collective effort and shared responsibility that were at the heart of Egypt's agricultural system. These modern approaches to farming recognize the importance of local food systems and the role of community in ensuring food security. Perhaps one of the most profound lessons Egypt offers is the integration of spirituality with agriculture. For the Egyptians, farming wasn't just a practical pursuit, it was a sacred duty. The land, water, and crops were seen as gifts from the gods, and the act of farming was a way to honor these divine forces. The Egyptian religion, with its pantheon of gods like Osiris, the god of fertility and agriculture, and Hapi, the god of the Nile's inundation, reinforced the importance of balance in all aspects of life, including agriculture. This connection between farming and religion instilled a sense of respect for nature and a recognition that the success of agriculture was not only dependent on human labor, but also on divine favor. Today, many people are beginning to recognize the importance of spiritual connection in their relationship with the land. In the face of environmental destruction and disconnection from nature, a renewed respect for the land, something that the ancient Egyptians understood, can help us find a more sustainable path forward. As Egypt's agricultural system was integrated with political power, it offers a crucial lesson in the need for effective governance in supporting sustainable food systems. The pharaoh, as both a divine ruler and a political leader, was seen as responsible for the fertility of the land and the well-being of the people. The state's role in managing water resources, grain storage, and land distribution was crucial to maintaining Egypt's agricultural success. Today, effective governance remains a critical factor in managing global food systems, ensuring that agricultural policies are designed to promote sustainability, equity, and long-term security. The Egyptians knew that the management of agriculture wasn't just a private affair. It required a well-organized, state-level effort to ensure that resources were distributed fairly and that the agricultural system could withstand the challenges posed by nature. The legacy of Egypt's agricultural success extends beyond the methods they developed to manage their environment. It also encompasses their commitment to building systems that would stand the test of time. The Egyptians didn't just create a food system that worked for a few years or a few decades. They developed practices and technologies that could sustain their civilization for centuries. The ancient Egyptians' ability to balance economic needs, environmental sustainability, and social cohesion provides an enduring blueprint for modern agricultural systems, especially as we work to build systems that can meet the needs of the growing global population while protecting the environment. In modern times, we face a unique challenge. How can we feed a growing population while reducing our environmental footprint? The ancient Egyptians, through their innovative practices and respect for nature, provide valuable insights into how we can meet this challenge. Water conservation, sustainable farming techniques, crop diversification, and community collaboration are all practices that have stood the test of time and continue to be relevant today. As we look forward to the future of agriculture, the wisdom of Egypt's ancient farming system offers both inspiration and guidance. Whether it is in the way we manage water, protect the soil, or engage with the land, we can draw from the principles that made Egypt's agricultural system successful for thousands of years. The ancient Egyptians didn't just grow food, they grew a thriving, resilient civilization that was intricately connected to the rhythms of the earth. Their agricultural system was built on sustainability, community, and a deep respect for the natural world, values that are still as important today as they were in the time of the pharaohs. In closing, the story of ancient Egypt's agricultural practices is not merely a historical tale. It is a testament to the ingenuity, adaptability, and enduring wisdom of a civilization that understood the power of working with nature, not against it. As we continue to navigate the challenges of modern agriculture, we would do well to remember the lessons that Egypt's farmers taught us, that a sustainable, resilient food system is built on a foundation of respect, balance, and foresight.